Dr. Scott Stevenson. It's great to have you on. It's an honor. I mean, I've been following you for I don't even know how long. I think I initially learned about you from Phil, my coach. I remember he used to
Okay.
post about your book all the time years ago. I got that book when I was like 16 or 17 back in the day. How to be your own bodybuilding coach.
Okay.
It's a great book. I recommend
Thank
it to
you.
everybody. But for those who don't know who you are, I guess let's just do like a quick background on you. I think everybody should know you are if you've been following bodybuilding, but a lot of my guys on here are the younger generation, mid-20s getting into this stuff, and I try to bring guys on like you that, are OGs, highly respected in this industry. So, yeah, just tell us a bit about you, how you got into all this, where you're at now, all that good stuff.
Okay. I'm the old guy, right? I'm the guy. It's funny. I kind of like we're just talking about. I'm getting ready to move, and I have these old contest T-shirts. Some of them are in pretty good shape. I'd be in the gym, and a young guy would come up to you, like maybe 20 something. He'd come up to me, and I'd have on a shirt with a date on it. It was like before they were born. Sometimes because I have these contest shirts. I just had them made into a giant like comforter. So I took all these old bodybuilders. It's kind of cool. Then I have to.
That's cool.
Yeah, I just had so many of them. So yeah, man, I just always, since I was a kid, I always wanted to work out. Finally, I got to do it when I was 11. I found some old diaries. I would sneak up to my dad's. He had a DP weight training machine, and I would do all the exercises on the poster, right? And sometimes twice, just because I felt good, and I just keep doing it. So it was just something that seemed like it was hardwired into me. And I kept on training through high school, typical high school, played football, swim team, blah, blah, blah. Went to college. Some people who are following me might notice I've been doing some podcasts and things in German. So I studied German in college, and now I'm doing bodybuilding podcasts in German too, which is kind of fun because I put the German aside for like 30 years.
I did see that. So you're not German. You just know German.
No, I had a great German teacher in high school. And then I'm like, I was good enough to pass through like the first 2 years of German in college. I'm like, I'm just going to make this a major. I would have been an engineer probably if my university had let me, but because I wanted to study German, they wouldn't let me study engineering, 2 different schools of the university. So I'm like, okay, I'll just study physics. Physics is cool too, but you can't get a job as a physicist with an undergraduate degree. So it was the silliest thing in retrospect, knowing what I know now, because I went on to become a college professor. I studied exercise physiology. You got a young kid comes in and says, I want to study engineering and German at the same time. No, you can't do that for administrative reasons. Huh? What the heck? That's just completely asinine. Anyway, so after college, I'm like, what am I going to do with my life? Where am I going to go? And I decided I'm going to follow my passion. Took the chance and started studying exercise physiology, master's degree, PhD, because I wanted to teach, became a college professor, owned a gym along the way, became an acupuncturist along the way, started competing in the late 90s, personal training in the early 90s. So I've been personal training since like 93. When the internet then kind of came about, I started coaching in the early 2000s. I was answering everyone's messages, back in the early days of the boards. People message you and you'd end up having, week-long exchanges. As this happens sometimes on Instagram. But back then it was a whole different story. And everyone was anonymous for the most part too. So I just started coaching people because I was getting so many inquiries. I'm like, I got to start coaching people. So I started doing that. And when did I start? I'm not even sure when I started my podcast. My podcast, Muscle Minds, originally with Jordan Peters. He decided to put his focus on his business. So he was there for the first year or two. I wrote my Fortitude. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say you used to coach him, right?
Yeah, I coached Jordan a couple times. When he got his NAVA Pro card, the things that people know the most is Jordan came to me. He had recently done a show, so he didn't come to me in his full blown off season, but he had recently done a show, and I think he was around 220 or so. And we took him using DC training, using dog crap training. So this is before I'd come up with Fortitude training. We took him from 220 to like 280, 285, something like that. And had to push him up to like 10,000 calories a day to do that. Jordan's a machine. Obviously, it's pretty obvious now. People see that. And like whatever it takes, he'd do it. Dot the I's, cross the T's. He never, perfect grammar, perfect punctuation, never missed a single meal. Everything happened. And, really good genetics. Jordan was a strong guy, long before I saw him. He had a kind of an Olympic lifting background. So really good genetics, but just indomitable will and drive and desire. And you put all that together. And I had been around for long enough to kind of guide him and kind of showed him the ropes as best I know them. And then a monster was born, and here he still is doing his thing. So
That's crazy. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, that was it. Then I came up. It was like 2018, I think. The Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book. Um, yeah, I was writing for John Meadows' site. John and I were interacting, and we actually kind of started to write that book. And then John had so many other obligations with Granite Supplements, the supplement company. I said, John, I'm going to just take this. He's like, yeah, go for it. So I was like, why not? And this is where my philosophy has come. And it's good that you have lots of young listeners, because this next message that I'm going to put out is the one I talk about all the time, is that you can do this shit on your own. You don't need a coach. Although you're a coach, right? People
Yeah.
I'm shooting myself in the foot as far as coaching goes, but I'm not shooting myself in the foot as far as helping people goes. But I think the internal goods, the satisfaction, the growth that comes from doing as much as you can on your own, being your own bodybuilding coach. That's why I called the book that. Can be so much greater than if you take on a coach who just tells you what to do. There's different ways of coaching. The way I do my quote unquote coaching now is consultations, where people come to me where they've turned over all the rocks they can, and they're like, I'm still not finding what I'm needing. And so I work with them and say, okay, why don't we try this? Or you could try this, that, and the other. And they come back as needed, ad lib, so to speak. And I help them help themselves, literally. So I sort of teach them how to fish. I use that analogy so often, rather than just saying, oh, do this, do this, do this. And a lot of people just want that. Like they don't want to think about it. They just want to be at the end. They want to look awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But then you miss out on the learning and what it takes to get there. And so often this is the perspective of having been around I've been training for like 43 years now, or 42 years, right?
Yeah.
So in and out of gyms, I was training in gyms, at that young age, training in high school, trained gyms all over the place. We talked about a little bit before we started the podcast itself, and people come and go. And I've got so many experiences where, for instance, like once I was working for a personal training company. This is early on when I was doing my master's degree. And sometimes the guy who owned the company would say, hey, I'm going to be out of town. Can you train my clients? And he was one of those guys who wanted to keep as many clients on his clientele as possible. So he basically cultivated in them a dependence upon him. And in talking, in this case, I'm thinking of particularly like two women, and talking to these clients, they were completely lost without him. They didn't know what to do. So much of their self-worth was based on what he said, because he was the magician. He was the maestro. He was the guy, the go-to guy, told him how to do everything, like each meal to change, etc. And they completely, in fact, whatever confidence they might have had as to what to do, they lost it working with him. I think he did that somewhat intentionally, because then he had a permanent client, which meant permanent income. So his focus was very opposite of what mine is. My goal is that I help someone out, or they read my book. Like I just had a client who came back to me, and he's like wanted to talk about some things. I'm like, hey, do you have my book yet? He's like, no. So he went and bought the book, and now he's just gobbling up the book. And I'm thinking, if you read the book, we're not going to have to talk. Like, you don't have to pay for a you bought the PDF for $60, right? 400 pages. Everything's in there. Like, you don't need to come back to me now and pay for a consultation that costs twice, three times as much. You don't get nearly the amount of information. But when he does come back, and this is people who contact me, I say this almost on a daily basis when I get contacted, is if you have read the book, you have that basis of information, then you're going to be able to ask so many better questions and more refined questions. So when we do talk about X, Y, or Z, you're like, okay, Scott, you said this and this and this. I'm not sure about how I piece these things together. They wouldn't have had a clue about A, B, and C had they not read the book, or they wouldn't have been able to connect A, B, and C at all. So we spend the whole content talking about A, B, and C, which for me is kind of boring. It's like, Okay,
Yeah.
done this before. But now they're at a higher level. They've gone from, high school to college or whatever. And now we're talking about higher level calculus as opposed to just basic arithmetic. And now we can have a more productive conversation to get much more bang for their buck. And now they can walk away and then they have more information. A lot of these guys people that I work with, guys and women, are coaches themselves. Now they can better inform. And that's what it's all about, man, for me, is to help people so that they can then pay it forward and help other people. So,
Yeah.
so that's what I do.
What you just said there kind of reminds me just a lot about how social media works at this point now, right? The problem is that I guess we have created this society. I'm sure it's always been like this to some extent, but it's gotten worse and worse where everybody just has these very short attention spans. Most people are not going to sit and want to even read a 400-page book, yet alone even watch like an hour podcast. And I know because all the time, you post a clip from the podcast, million comments, asking these questions. Like if you just took an hour and listened to the podcast, you wouldn't even have this question, or you would know how to just phrase it much better so we could have a much more productive conversation. But then you're going back and forth with the comments and stuff. But it's like, just watch the podcast, because I'm not going to be able to explain this to you in a comment when it's there in long format in the video for you for that reason,
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, the way in which the brain could be entrained during the course of development in adolescence, and even, Robert Sapolsky suggests, I looked this up once, our prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed on average until we're about the age of 25, right? So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for sort of our higher cognitive processes, where we sort of inhibit those immediate desires. So someone walks up to you and says, "Man, you're an asshole," and you might be like, you're thinking, "Okay, I'll show you what an asshole I am." That you might be aroused your amygdala might get fired up, right? I'm just making up a facetious example, but it's your prefrontal cortex would say, "Hey, pipe back down. Maybe this guy thinks you're someone else." Like people, I'm somewhat of a generic looking person to some degree. I've had many people come up to me, it used to happen on a regular basis, and say they thought I was someone that they knew. I was in the bank line one time when I lived back in Arizona, and this woman just standing behind me, I didn't really realize she was there, and she just says out loud, so she was talking to me, she's like, "I just about kicked your ass." And I'm like, "What?" She thought I was her ex-husband. She had a restraining order against the guy. He was supposed to be in Colorado at the time, so we had this funny exchange. But I didn't like turn around and say, "What?" I said, "Okay," and that was my prefrontal cortex saying, "Well, that's an interesting thing." So that's not developed. So when you spend hours, and kids are spending, like, I'm talking about younger adolescents and young people too, are spending 8 hours a day on their phones. Their brains are learning to deal with short segment pieces of information, and they're not getting the experience to say, "Hey, what happens?" Because it can be really enlightening to take a paper where someone was maybe quote unquote an abstract scientist, and they pulled a quote from the abstract, right? And you take that paper and say, "Hey," because the abstracts don't always represent. Sometimes abstracts can be very, very manipulative in terms of what actually the data that are presented in the paper say, depending on who you are. You take that paper and you read it, and if you have a modicum of intelligence and you're willing to look things up on occasion because you don't know what that means, you just go look it up, just keep looking it up. By the time you work your way through a paper, like, this can be a highly rewarding process. It's like, wow, I learned so much more. But if you haven't done that, if you haven't experienced that, right? It's kind of like, I'll use an analogy. Analogies seem to work pretty well. It's like you're walking along the street and you've got all these vending machines that are full of, like, those orange crackers, which probably cause 15 types of cancer, and Hostess ding dongs and all sorts of whatever, could stand a nuclear holocaust. And if you get hungry, you just swipe your credit card and you eat junk food all day long. You're fine. Or you could take a side street and go find a Greek restaurant, or Italian restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, or a Japanese restaurant, and you could have some real food, which all in all might cost you a little bit more. But you don't know what you're missing, because you always stay with that immediate gratification of, "Oh, I'm hungry, give me some Doritos. Oh, I'm hungry, give me some junk food," whatever it might be. That's what social media can very much do, even with people, and myself included, who are putting out good content. even with the good, because it has to be because of the nature, for instance, of the Instagram platform, which is it's a double-edged sword by its very nature. In order to get people to hear your message, you have to make it easily consumable, which then entrains that problem. So you're dancing
You
with the
have to play
devil
the
here.
game.
Yeah, you have to play
There's
the
no way
game,
around it.
right? And I know I've done, like, there was a couple years ago now, maybe there was a series of informative, I thought very informative posts I was making, and I would take like pictures, on stage pictures of me where I was in good shape with shredded glutes or my lats, Christmas tree, big thing. And that would be the picture, right? To grab your eye, total clickbait, right? And then the post was about who knows what. I don't know what the post was even about, but I remember using those pictures like, we'll see what happens here. See if this, and that's what you got to do. So being aware, there's a video I put out, I should probably repost the being aware of the video I put out was about the idea of clean thinking, which is analogous to clean eating. So clean eating, whatever that means for you, you choose the foods that you think are best for whatever your dietary goals are, not highly processed stuff, the stuff on the perimeter of the grocery store, whatever it might be. That's maybe clean eating for you. That's a kind of a hard thing to define, but most people have their own subjective perception of what that means. Clean thinking would be having sort of almost a third person perspective on what am I feeding my brain when I sit there and just swipe away all day long? What am I allowing? Because the idea of Facebook, of Instagram, of online ads, everything is to continually and constantly distract you. It's to feed your brain junk food, right? And am I going to take the time to be kind to myself, to be loving of myself, and go and look for or dive deeper when I have the opportunity? I was just reading another person on Instagram, and he was putting the PubMed ID numbers for all the studies for his citations in his posts. And I went and looked up one of those citations, and the quote was actually cited the quote that he had taken cited another paper. I went to that paper. That paper then cited another paper. So I went to that paper. I had to go back like 3 steps to find, and I found a gem of a paper that I didn't realize was out there. I'm like, okay, this is cool. So, and it took me, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes to get there. Just, going one thing or another, reading, download the PDFs. I put them in a large database. I use EndNote. People are interested in that. But thank goodness he had the references there. So the avenues, this is what I have in my book, my 400-page book. There's like 2,000 references or something like that. There's like 100, like the last 100 pages almost are references.
Yeah.
Right. And the PDF has clickable references. So you want to know, like, well, why the heck does he say that? Well, there's a reference, number 467. It's hyperlinked. It takes you to the bibliography, and then you can look up that paper. A lot of times click on the link for the PubMed entry and go right to that paper. So it's an entry. It's a multiple rabbit hole, a plethora of rabbit hole entry point, which was intentional. So people can then educate themselves. So social media is about being given fish and isn't really teaching you to fish, unfortunately. And that's, they made the platform that way intentionally. It's set up so that you can't, like, one last little mini rant, like Facebook is like this. Instagram's the same thing. On the old school forums, like the V-Bulletin style forums, like you could see everyone's post had sort of equal prominence, and it was easy to go through and read those. Like Professional Muscle, Intense Muscle was the board I was on. It's no longer really terribly active. There's a few people posting it. But Professional Muscle is still pretty active. That's an old school forum. You could read whatever person saw, and they weren't hierarchical. They weren't like sub posts like you see on Reddit sometimes. Like on Instagram, I don't know how people even try to read that. It's like you miss so many things. You could have someone who responded to something and had this phenomenally insightful Buddha-like post, which is completely missing, and no one quotes it. You don't see it. You don't know it's there because the system's set up so that you don't have meaningful exchange. I think it's intentional. This is my conspiracy theory perspective. I think it's intentional because they don't want people to actually have a higher level intellectual interaction. They want to keep you sort of consuming the junk food in terms of your clean eating for your brain.
Well, see, It's hard to. I mean, I don't think anybody really understands how the algorithm exactly works. The algorithm's always it's always changing.
I
Um,
know.
but what obviously the way that it works is whatever catches people's attention the fastest, which is what people have been programmed to see. So things that are very clickbaity, have those controversial statements at the front, have somebody that looks insane or a girl with, a big butt. It's like these things grab attention. And then that's whatever grabs attention first within that first couple of seconds, that's what gets pushed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have something that's well thought out and meaningful, that's usually not a part of that. That's usually, it starts off on a slower pace and most people will just, since they're already programmed, they're just going to go right past it. So now it just gets hidden lower and lower and
Mm-hmm.
lower. And then eventually, like, it's not getting shown to 60% of your following or more. And then
Yeah.
the post is just lost.
Yeah. It's a difficult thing to balance. Like, for instance, Dante Trudell, right? A
Yes.
lot of people know Dante. A lot of people follow Dante. For those who don't, I'd suggest following him. And he just sort of writes blocks of text. And his writing is very gripping. It brings you in. It's very enjoyable to read the things he writes, because
and then he'll write like 5 comments that are
right.
also posted
He'll
in
have
the
a
post
7 or
too.
8 part post, right, to
Yeah,
explain
yeah.
his point. Well, that writing style was something that you'd see on the boards,
Yeah.
right? And he's trying to fit that to Instagram now, but he's going to get outcompeted in many cases. Some people know about him and they look for that and they click on his stuff, so the algorithm keeps showing you his stuff, which is great. That's a nice thing, at least partially, I think. But he's going to get outcompeted by the big butts, or the guys that have video shopped their videos. You know who Goob_U2 is?
Yeah, no, Goob, I just saw him this weekend.
Okay, you know him personally then. All right, so
A little bit. He
yeah,
was at the show that I was just at, yeah.
yeah. So he does some interesting stuff. He calls people out. People, I think the first thing he was doing was calling people out who were photoshopping, atrociously.
Yeah.
So that happens, but that's a way to outcompete people. The thing that's kind of difficult. It makes sense in the one sense, but otherwise you have to be aware. This is where we're being aware of what you're doing. Is the algorithm's going to keep you in your own bubble. It's not going to necessarily expose you to information that might run counter to the things that you're interested in. So let's say you have a particular political inclination.
Confirmation bias.
It's going to confirm your bias. Absolutely. Over and over and over again. And then when you see just mountains and mountains of information that confirm your bias, well, then it's going to continue to happen. People can get very stuck that way. So being aware that happens, that you have a confirmation bias, is a difficult thing to step out of. It's a very difficult thing to step out of. And egos function, I think, in a different way online than they do in real person. People say things, people think differently, they react differently. The ethics of how you can express yourself online are very different than how they are in person. So
Definitely.
yeah.
That leads me into something interesting here. With the whole confirmation bias thing is obviously you taught at you were a professor for how long?
Just a couple years.
A couple years.
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously you're very highly regarded. Would you consider yourself like, one of those science-based guys? Would you consider yourself in that realm?
I try to bridge.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just a meathead who loves everything about it. So I try to take the science, try to appropriately understand it, but science doesn't tell you everything. There's all sorts of there's substantial limitations in the exercise science. It's a very soft science. So yeah.
Do you think how do you feel about the current state of that side of the community? Because what I personally see a lot is a lot of that confirmation bias from that side, very dogmatic approaches, very just, the literature is the gospel, and people are thinking that they're necessarily like reinventing the wheel of training when,
Mm-hmm.
I don't personally don't agree with it, but what is your perspective? I'm sure you see a lot of these things, doing only one set, staying in lower rep range, the fatigue is the devil, minimize all fatigue. Like there's all these ways
Right.
being brought back to like, this is the best way to train. This is the most optimal.
Yeah, it depends on who you're talking about. I think there's just like everything, there's a range in terms of how dogmatic some people present their information. Some try to paint things in a black and white manner, which is highly consumable. It,
Yes.
it, it makes sense. I'm one of those guys who frequently says it depends.
Yes. So
Because
am I. Yeah.
yeah, because in almost, I mean, there are some things, some absolutes, like I don't think arsenic is anabolic. I think pretty much you can't,
Yeah.
because arsenic is not going to be good for bodybuilding purposes.
Yeah.
The thing that I think is most often missed, and some of this is because confirmation bias takes hold in the way information is perpetuated, is are the limitations and the delimitations of the exercise science. So the limitations are the things that are sort of beyond the control of the scientists, right? So I'll pick on myself there. So when I did my PhD dissertation, we chose a one-legged model to study the hypertrophic or the anabolic effects of creatine, and we used electrical stimulation training, which evokes muscle growth more profoundly than voluntary training. There's some previous studies that had demonstrated that. And we used trained guys, right? So we trained one leg. They weren't. It didn't matter from the training perspective, at least, if they knew they were taking creatine or not. One of the problems with creatine is you can have a placebo effect because someone's weighing themselves, there's a bodybuilder, and they're paying attention, like, okay, they're going to give me creatine, they're going to give me a placebo. And they think, well, creatine's super anabolic, right? And they start weighing themselves, and all of a sudden they put on 5 pounds of water. It's like, oh, I'm on creatine. They're going to change things. They might train harder. You can have a placebo effect. It's a whole other topic. Um, so we trained with electrical stimulation. It's a very powerful stimulus. We could talk about that. It's a very, very, very cool way to train if you have the right equipment to do this. And the guy who had the greatest increase in size also came to me during a period where he was wanting to put on muscle size too, right? And we had a control leg, right? But he was someone, and I found this out only like basically afterwards. And I asked my advisor, "Are we going to keep him in there?" He's like, "Yeah, keep him in there. This is the shit that just it's a limitation of the study." Asked him to keep their diet the same, but he decided to go to Smoothie King. This was when I was in Athens, Georgia, and he was getting the Hulk, which was the with like 2 extra protein scoops in it. It was like
Mhm.
a $25 protein shake with 2,000 calories in it, and he was doing that like every day. That was like something that he wasn't doing before. Did he probably eat less outside that meals? I don't know. We didn't do a dietary recall, so that's a huge limitation because those are typically limited. If I maybe had done a dietary recall, he may have been thinking, I'm not supposed to be doing this. He might not have even told me. He told me not knowing that I'm going to like, you did what? What are you doing? We're not supposed to do that. So that's a limitation of the study. You're going to have those sorts of things happening all the time. It's very, uh, it's very uncommon that I've seen where they actually ask the subjects after the fact if they knew whether they were on um, the creatine, if they're in the placebo group, or if they're in the group that got whatever substance they were, whatever supplement, let's say, they were testing. So if they were aware of what they were supposed to be blinded to. So that's a limitation. Then there's the delimitations that is very often forgotten. And Lyle McDonald actually put up a video on this. I didn't watch the whole thing, but the question was basically around the notion that um, our studies almost never go longer than 6 months, at least interventional studies where you take a group and you train them and do something and measure something, muscle growth, fiber growth, what have you. So the question is can we extrapolate? Is there external validity from a 12 or an 8-week study that then applies to the course of 3 years of training?
Yeah.
So, like the training in the stretch position idea, we have a number of short studies. And if there is a sarcomerogenesis going on there, so you're making fascicles longer, you're adding sarcomeres in series, right? And then increasing less the mass of the muscle, the size of the muscle. When you standardize the length of the muscle, if you made it longer, when you have it a standardized length, then you're going to have greater volume. If you measure volume across section area, you've got more sarcomeres, you've got more muscle mass, right? But that can only happen to a limited extent. Eventually, unless you're getting taller at the same time, You can't just keep on lengthening things. That will reach a limit. There's some limitation there. So take someone who hasn't ever trained doing just partial movements in the lengthened position. That's a novel stress. But at what point does that stress stop being novel? Well, maybe it does get you gains for the first 3 or 4 months, which is awesome, right? This could be something you take someone who's been training through 3 or 4 years. They've typically not been doing full range of motion stuff, and you add that in. That could be an increment in size. But does that increment mean that they have an improvement that then plateaus off because they've basically now exploited the extent to which they can get sarcomerogenesis, or they can get novelty out of that new parameter in their training? Or does that mean that their training is just going to continually be more effective for year after? Well, we don't know because the studies aren't out there. So you can't say that. You can't make that but people want to make that conclusion, right? And say that. And the science just doesn't. That's a delimitation of the study. Is we didn't do that. Our studies, if our delimitation would be like we trained, these were elderly women. Can we say this is the case with young postmenopausal elderly women, who are suffering from osteoporosis? They may have some physical limitations that don't apply to young college age males. You might expect that some of those things could potentially apply, but if you haven't studied them, you need to make note of that, and that needs to be known. And the extent to which there might be carryover is an unknown factor until you do that study then with males. And that's just one study. We've got replication problems too that happens. That could be a huge issue, is that how many people go and do the same study with the same training program.
Yeah.
It's a huge problem. We don't have, I always liken this to pharmacology. It's right. We want to see, what are the effects of 3 times 200 milligrams of naproxen on headache pain, on knee joint pain, on hip pain, on low back pain, on liver issues, 1 week, 2 week, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. Your standardized dose would be the recommended dose on the bottle, 3 times 200 milligrams. That's the max you do. That's what people do. Or maybe you do a body weight relative dose, whatever it is, but it's a standardized dose. And then you see what effects it has. Well, we don't have a standardized exercise program for a resistance exercise. Everyone creates a brand new program. Sometimes that's the purpose of the study, to compare volume, let's say. But all the other parameters, study by study, it's not like saying, well, let's see what happens when we do 3 times dosing, right? So it's 3 times dosing, and now we're going to just change the amount of the naproxen in each dose. Like that would trying to keep things constant. Like it's like, no, we're going to go with a liquid form, and we're going to do sublingual liquid form. That's so you got different mechanism of absorption potentially, and everything gets changed around because different labs come up with their own different training programs. They still have that internal variable of volume, let's say, that they're trying to examine. But when you want to try to compare study to study, you can't, because they use different exercises, right?
Yeah.
And a different training regime.
Yeah.
That muddies the waters tremendously.
Yeah, no, there's tons of limitations in studies, and this is something I always deal with from that self-proclaimed science-based community. I say that because a lot of those people that identify in that community, I think, aren't actually science-based. I think they use it kind of as a way to have like that confirmation bias and feel like they are superior in some extent because they can like cite literature. But the guys who are actually more science-based, like I would say you are more, because you understand the nuances, you have practical application, you understand the limitations within that, and trying to explain that to those people is nearly impossible because they can't see past what's on the abstract of the study. They can't see, okay, well, in the study, how did they quantify like sleep? How was, their diets accounted for? What were the differences in this person's like trainee level? What exercises were they doing? Yeah. There's all these little variables that come into play when we're talking about bodybuilding and, maximizing muscle growth. It's like, it's so hard to come to the conclusion that like, this is an absolute answer. And the studies really never even say that either way. They always say like, we need more research usually within it too, which is funny because people always like to leave that part out.
It like in the context of social media, to to list all those limitations or delimitations, it's just not snazzy. It's just not fancy. And
No.
good scientists know this, right? And many of
Hmm.
the scientists who sometimes get criticized, they know this, but they just don't say it every single time. See, we've got a situation where a lot of the a lot of research that was done, and this will still be done, of course, in exercise science was done with animals, like research animals. So they're very genetically homogeneous. They're siblings, and they're very, very close to one, closer because they've been bred to be very, very similar. So you're going to get the same adaptation, same responses from them, and they get housed in the same light dark cycle in the same room. Maybe one cage is closer to the other one, so that animal gets stressed out more every time the researchers come in and out, and the other one's at the end of the thing. So it's like, oh, I got the penthouse here because I've just chilled, and they hardly ever fuck with me over here. Um,
Hmm.
but so they've got this homogeneity, and they get the same food. Everything is identical, right? That's why it's nice, for instance, with human stuff, where you can use a one-legged model and train one leg one way, for instance, and another leg the other way, because then you've got two different variables. We've got the same variable, two different conditions, and everything else is the same. It's the same person, the same diet, same genetics, blah blah blah. But when you take a group of individuals, and we know we have this biological interindividuality, and I've talked about this ad nauseum on my podcast. And then you don't have them in a lab condition. You don't have them clinically restrained, which is what they've done in some of the studies looking at genetic variability. For instance, when you overfeed or underfeed people, these are massively expensive studies. You constrain them to a clinic, right, where you control the food they get and you control their activity, and they're being watched, supervised 24/7. When you send people out into the world, you've got a whole host of other variables. These are the limitations that aren't being controlled. They could be, but you just don't have the money to pay someone, you know, $10,000 so that they can just lift weights 5 times a week and live with you the rest of the time. It's just not going to, there's no money for that. It's not going to happen.
Hmm.
But that's what you can do in animal research. So it makes this a very soft science, where you also know, even when you do things like take people into a lab. I've got a whole talk I do on, the title of the talk is why you don't look like a pro. And it's showing the extent of this biological interindividuality across basically every parameter that I've ever looked into related to bodybuilding. So you can take, for instance, just measure protein synthesis after a standardized bout. And you see this normal distribution. Some people have protein synthesis which is turned on tremendously. Other people, they get zippo. You look at adaptation wise, you look at strength gains. It's this normal curve. Some people are extreme responders. Some people don't respond at all. Right?
Uh-huh.
You look at blood glucose curves when you give just basic stuff like white bread and glucose. You get different curves. Sometimes it's higher for one food source versus another in one person. Sometimes it's the other way around. Um, you can go on and on. Basically, everything, all the drug, there's pharmacogenomics for every different drug, which means you have differential responses there. There's single nucleotide polymorphisms for things like the phosphodiesterase. It strips away the esterified fatty acid from a testosterone enanthate, which gives about 60% greater bioavailability just for like a standardized 200 milligram testosterone, I think it was cypionate in this study, dose. So people getting 60% more test from a standardized 200. It's a standardized dose, but they have more bioavailability because of one little enzyme, right?
Yeah.
So this stuff's
Yeah.
all over the place. There's so many. There's just a litany. So we have from a scientific perspective, in drawing a heterogeneous pool of subjects, even if they're like all at the same college, you're standardized, college age students, pulling people, you're starting off with a very inferior design, statistically speaking, in order to, if you're looking to tease out a particular effect of different training volume or how many reps in reserve you did. So that's why a lot of people now are they're doing more meta-analyses to try to get an overall average effect, and that has the strength, and that it kind of tells you what your best bet might be from the general population, but it doesn't answer the individual question. And
No.
You can find that in many studies now where they show the individual data and you're like, okay, now I see what's going on. Some people respond to this, some people don't. So
Yeah.
yeah, you just got to know this. You just got to understand this. If you take a study and say, okay, this is how it is, black and white, this does that. It's like, look, if you see the subjects, like, no, it didn't. Like my
Yeah.
favorite study is a study. You maybe heard me talk about this, Damas et al. From like 2018, I think, and they trained one leg either 2 or 3 times a week, 3 sets of 10 to failure. They trained the other leg, just knee extensions, five times a week, 3 sets to failure. So different volume and different frequency. Did it make a difference? The first study, Barcelos, I think was the name, first name. No difference. Doesn't matter. You look at it, say like, okay, and that was their conclusion. It didn't make a difference. All equal. What they like, hold on here. Let's look at our individuals here. Because we have people, like I mentioned before, who are the same person is training lower volume and higher volume. One leg low volume, one leg high volume. Right? This is limited. This is a specific situation here. We have our delimitations. These are untrained people, right? They're just doing knee extensions. But there's a principle that I think comes out of this. And you saw some people did better with high volume, about 1/3 versus low volume in terms of muscle growth. Some people, it was the other way around. Some people, it didn't matter. It was equal. There were people who responded really well, regardless, whatever strategy was applied, low or high volume. And there were some that didn't respond. So you had people who responded, people who didn't respond very well. Some people did better with high volume, better with low volume. It was all over the place, right? But the first study suggested it didn't make a difference. But the individual that said absolutely it did.
Take 2. We had some technical difficulties yesterday. Well, I did. My power went out randomly, so we had to cut it short. We're going to pick back up here now. Thanks for coming back on. I appreciate you coming back here to do this. Do you remember where we were at? I think we were talking about the limitations within science and the whole science-based community. That's kind of where I think I cut off, or you cut off at that point.
I can't tell you exactly. There was a number of mini rants that we were on. Probably it might be better to just for you go back and cut it off where it makes sense, and we can just start a new topic because I can't tell you where my stream of consciousness was at the time.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's just pick back up here. Let's go with Fortitude training. Let's start talking about Fortitude training.
The outline we had, which we didn't cover it all last time. So yeah, we can do that.
We were getting into it a little bit, but then once I started getting into it, it got cut off. But Fortitude training, right? Tell me about Fortitude training. What is it all about?
So I just basically took basic principles of training that I've figured out on my own over the course of, at that time, like 35 years of training, and that are also substantiated by the science. And I just took the ingredients and I made something with it. It's kind of like it's like baking a cake. Like you can take salt, sugar, and baking powder and flour, and you can make all sorts of things, right? You could make bagels, you could make cakes, you could maybe make a pie. So I just took those ingredients and threw them together. And the most basic recipe was what is in the book as Fortitude training. So the ingredients are progressive overload. I chose a little bit of a higher frequency than what many people do because it seems like that was something that was sort of missing from the landscape of programs that are out there. It's also something that is outside of what many people are willing to do. I've had people come to me, like for instance, I had one person come to me who was actually a very well-known influencer, and he wanted me to train him in person to bring his legs up because he couldn't get him to grow. And I said, well, have you ever trained like more than like it's once a week for you, right? And he said, yeah. So we'll hit him 3 times a week. He's like, no, you can't do that. I'm like, no, we're not going to do 20 sets each time. We're going to take whatever your volume was, maybe adjust it somewhat and just split it up over those sessions. And he's like, no, you can't do that. I think basically he didn't want to train legs that often because he wanted to suffer through it, get it done, and not have to think about it for 5 or 6 days. So It's a little bit higher frequency training program. Everything gets hit about 3 times a week. There's one version where things hits 4 times a week. But it includes other very, very important pieces, some of which I do know we talked about last time. One, there's this biological individuality in terms of ability to recover. Some people need more volume. Some people need less volume. That Damas et al. Study that I mentioned before, 2, 3, or 5 times a week training, that hadn't come out yet. I just knew that this was the case. You look, for instance, at most of the best bodybuilders in the world. Most of them, the pros, are doing a pro split or a bro split, and they're training once every 5 to 7 days, and they're training with a pretty high volume. And these are also the people who have really good genetics. That's how they got where they are. Dorian Yates is maybe in the highest frequency, lowest volume. He's the best example of an extraordinarily successful, massive bodybuilder. And then you got people like Ronnie Coleman, who was training twice a week. Also, he was actually training for, I don't know if maybe technically at a higher frequency than Dorian, but with just a volume that at the time no one else could even match. It was really funny. I've mentioned this before. I know, I do recall specifically there was an interview with King Kamali talking about, when Ronnie won the Olympia for the first time. Everyone's like, okay, that's what it takes. Like, now we know something. There's something, because this guy, he's like, holy shit, Ronnie just blew up, right? So people started trying to train push-pull legs 2 times a week frequency, and no one could do it. No one could hang with his training program and train like that. So there's this broad spectrum of adaptive capacity amongst individuals. And there, for instance, is like a little deep dive into this topic, is one of the things that the research generally supports. There's some wishy-washiness in there. It's somewhat contentious, but generally supports is that satellite cells are important for muscle growth. When a muscle cells start to grow, protein synthesis is obviously turned on. The fibers will get larger. Initially, you won't necessarily see an increase in the number of satellite cells, but on the long haul, generally you see that this idea of a myonuclear domain holds. So you need more satellite cells to govern the domain of each of those, what actually are nuclei now. So you need these satellite cells to be turned on, make copies of themselves to proliferate, make their way into the cell, and set up shop as new nuclei. And that takes some time. The most genetically gifted people, the people who are the genetic outliers in the training studies that have done, are those that produce more of the growth factors that turn on this process and actually have more satellite cells to begin with. So that is one of the things that seems to be key to muscle growth, and something that differentiates those who do really, really well for growth. It also may be, and there's minimal data on this, I got to admit this, I wish there were more, but it seems like that process, you can follow the expression of a protein called PAX7 plus, I believe, I guess. And it's maybe a process that lasts like 5, 6, 7 days. So one study was a muscle soreness study, so it wasn't a training study. But so if someone turns on that process, it's something that's going to run and be working towards the satellite cell involvement in muscle growth for 5, 6 days. So that matches the training frequency. If you're someone who turns it on process really well, you train every 5, 6, 7 days, and then you hit it again. But it seems like that many individuals, one way that seems to work in many cases, it's not the penultimate solution, but if everyone is, let's say, dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's for bringing weak muscle groups, one thing they can do is start training more frequently. That may be because they're getting a little bit of what was a suboptimal growth factor expression to turn on the satellite cell involvement just from a single training session. Maybe they need to do that more often, and maybe that's why that works. So I created a higher frequency program, and I created a program that has 3 volume tiers. So I gave it structure. Some at the highest volume tier, I've done it before just to have been there, and it's too much for me. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I did it one year going into a prep just to see what happened, and it was not optimal at all. But there are women, for instance, tend to recover better than men. They can handle higher training volume. I did a pilot study had some kind of beta testers. I had one guy who trained really hard, and he just had incredible recovery. He was just a workhorse, and he could train with volume tier 3, the highest volume tier, right in through the show. And he was cool with it. He trained hard, been training for years. I had another guy, actually was a much better bodybuilder, also trained really, really hard. And he was barely able to hang in there with volume tier 1, which is less than half the volume of volume tier 3. It's kind of hard to calculate it because of the nature of the set type. So, and I'll cover that in a second. So I allowed that to be in there to match the recoverability of the people who would use it. It's so vitally important, which the Stama study sort of substantiated later on. So a flexibility built into the program. You still know what you're supposed to do. It's not like, oh shit, like it's just like how many sets should I do? Should I just sort of wing it? It's like, no, you switch to volume tier 1 if 2 is too much. And then you do that. There's also a periodization aspect to it. So you would train, most people don't make it more than 6 weeks training hard at the appropriate volume tier before they need to have a deload. And I structured not to just take time completely off, but I made the deload a taper, like what many athletes do. And tapers are set up to reduce both the frequency and the volume of training. So people would drop down a volume tier. They would train maybe 3 times a week instead of 4, which is the typical frequency overall. They're training everything 4 times a week, 3 times a week, but 4 training sessions per week. So, and then they would take some time off with a taper, one that works. This is just a generic taper. It's very basic, but it's a place to start. People come back then stronger. And the hope would be that if you do that, then that strength would to some degree at least get you going on a better track, because you can load better with more tension for more growth as you go into the next blast. It may not be hyper. We don't have the data on that, especially not this specific application. So that was sort of set up for people. The length of the deload would be about 1/3 the length of the blast. So if you went for 6 weeks on your blast, you do a cruise. I stole these terms from Dante Trudell. It's a progressive blast, intensive cruise. You would just drop to muscle rounds, which makes things fun. You can try out exercises. It's really it can be a really fun time. And you reduce your frequency and you're just doing muscle rounds. You're still training hard. The muscle rounds, if you do them appropriately, you're still going to failure. You're still training hard. So it's still intensive training, but just less volume. Then you take about 1/3 of that 2 weeks, in this case, time off. You don't do any training. You go fun. You set up your family vacation. You just chill, active recovery if you want to. No like 20-mile hikes. And then you come back just chomping at the bit. So if you
only
want
to do that for 6 weeks, if you were to do the 6-week blast,
you do 6 weeks blast and then 2 weeks cruise. So 1/3. The ratio is about 3-to-1. If you did 3 weeks blast, which you could, some people just want to go for broke. They'd rather feel like they're just pushing at their edge, right? Mm-hmm. And this requires auto-regulation. You have to be able to, and you're going to make mistakes and find, okay, that was too much. But then you would take a 1-week cruise as the basic structure.
Is this just referred to training, or is this including like PEDs as well?
PEDs are a whole other topic.
Because I know you mentioned Dante, and Dante would also do like 6-week blasts and then do these short little cruises, no?
I was the official DC trainer for, I don't know, several years now. I can't remember, 3 or 4 years maybe. He was sending me. I was the person he officially sent people to. Blasting and cruising is a term that comes from PED use, right?
Yeah.
He would use that in the context of training. And in DC training, at least, the sort of the formalized version. DC training is whatever Dante says, really. It's dog crap training. Mm-hmm. But how long the blast was dependent on the person. And he did the cruise differently. So some people would just take the entire time off. Some people would just drop down to lighter loads and leave like 3 reps in the tank. But it didn't. One last thing on that. This is one thing I wanted to kind of quote unquote correct, because some people, that was awesome, was perfect. They just naturally auto-regulated. Some people would make great progress on their weights during the DC, and it's very, very weight progressive over based. And then they do those 2 weeks, whatever strategy they employed, and they lost half the gains that they made over the course of the first 8 weeks, let's say. And so they get 2 steps forward, take 1 step back. And I'm like, let's remedy that. Use the taper phenomenon, and then you come back stronger. And I'll tell you a story, but first your question. I didn't want you to.
No, I was just asking that because I did read. I read up on this a lot. I don't want to get like too off topic, but about androgen receptor downregulation, upregulation, all that good stuff. And I know Dante was at least at one point a proponent of doing these shorter 6 to 8 week cycle blasts, and then he would come off, on what his cruise. I guess what I read from what he wrote was 500 milligrams test would be his cruise for a couple weeks, and then go blast again, because he felt like that's how he got the best progress. I'm sure, I don't know if you've had these conversations with him, but I was just asking if like that would be directly related to the way that he would approach training, is when he would take that time off, if that would be considered like that that also that cruise phase in terms of training, he would line that up if
So
that's what makes sense.
yeah. So the thing is with there's cycles for pennies, which was like from 2001 or something like, and Dante's, those were his thoughts over 20 years ago. And some of those things Dante doesn't ascribe to anymore. Those aren't ways he would do it. The way I know that I believe that Dante still suggests people cycle those things is that during an off season when a lot of people are just blasting everything, he's big on let the food and the training do the work. Maintain your testosterone levels, so you might be on a at least TRT, maybe a bodybuilder's TRT, not like 500 milligrams a week, not a gram, nothing like that, and some growth hormone to help with recovery. So real basics stuff, just so you're a slightly superhuman, so to speak, but you're not blasting anything. And that would be something you would use whether or not you're blasting or cruising training wise during the off season. And then during your prep is because so now you've actually made gains, and if you do this appropriately, you can actually grow during the off season. It might not be massive. You might, if you're an advanced guy, you might get 3-4 pounds of muscle, which is not bad at all. But then your sensitivity, you talk about androgen receptor per se upregulation, downregulation, that doesn't necessarily match the sensitivity to the drug. There's this thought in the notion in people's minds that the amount of the receptor is equal to the sensitivity to the drug. And obviously, the more you use, the lower your sensitivity to drugs go down. It's not like you use a small amount and you get X effect, use more, and the androgen receptors go up, which many studies suggest that androgens upregulate androgen receptors. Doesn't mean that would be this like feed forward process where the growth would just get exponentially better the more you used. And it's not the case. You have a law of diminishing returns. So like that mindset like never sort of made sense to me. It's like, okay, that's true, but the androgen receptors, true, that is one feature of the signaling, the number of receptors that are there to receive the androgen. But what happens in the nucleus in terms of turning on genes, that's a different story. So that's how Dante would generally do it, is people would then grow into the show, right? So maybe I don't know, let's just say theoretically someone gains 3 or 4 pounds of muscle in their off season. They get a little bit fat, not too fat, so they have to still be in target range, shooting range of getting in shape for the show. And then they might gain 5 pounds of muscle into the show, and then in the next off season they get another 3 pounds in the off season, and then they gain 4 pounds, 3 pounds the next. So they're gaining 5 or 6, 7 pounds a year, but they're only spending 4 months out of the year on, as opposed to all year long. Right. And that's for everyone. It kind of depends on what their limits are going to be, how their health markers are. I'm big on, as long as you're not hurting anyone else. Obviously, if you die, you're going to hurt people because they're going to be very sad that you're gone. So that's kind of a hard thing to say. But as long as you're not directly causing harm to others, if someone, I sometimes you hate to see it when someone is knowingly doing themselves harm, because it's probably happening. There have been guys who've died recently that I've been in communication with, and that others have, that knowingly were causing harm to themselves, trying to figure things out. And Dante's talked to many people as well who are doing harm to themselves, and he's helped them come out of that. And then they go back to doing what they were doing before that got them in the trouble that he helped them out of. But whatever, someone might say, you know what, I'm not going to do it that way. I want to get that extra 3%, and I'm going to cycle all year round, and maybe have like 3 weeks off during a cruise. And I mean, if you train blast for 10 weeks and you take 3-week cruise training wise, and then you come off of the drugs for 3 weeks, I mean, how long are you actually off on the drugs? You're not really off. I mean, in terms of half-lives, you're probably not off unless you really time it. You might have like 1 week when your androgen level, well, the androgens are not even a week, probably, if it's only 3 weeks, like to get everything out.
Still be circulating.
Yeah. And then to have the restorative processes going on to get you back, like you're just kind of pissing in the wind. What you're doing is you're maybe setting yourself up for greater sensitivity. It's a little bit of a break. It's like you're running your Lamborghini at 110 on the highway. And, when you go through the small towns, you drop it down to 50, for 3 or 4 minutes, and then you crank it up. It's like, yeah, you're still running full bore the entire time almost. So It's not the same as like going to a pit stop, changing your oil, da da da. So,
Yeah.
um,
Okay. Back to Fortitude training here. You
yeah.
said one of the it's really revolved. It's heavy on progressive overload.
Mm-hmm.
Same as like DC training was. You're using these higher frequency approaches, which has come back in popularity recently. I've seen that as well with the higher frequency. For a while, you know, a lot of people were saying that frequency doesn't matter when volume is equated. I said that myself, and I also was one of the people who basically my entire training career, ever since I was young, I always followed like a bro split type of approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
5 days a week. Well, when I was younger, it was 6 days a week. That stopped a long time ago. But the once or maybe twice a week for like a lagging muscle group, I would do like twice a week or something like that. Usually like a back day or split my leg days up. It's always worked great for me.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there's genetic factors at play there. It's worked great for a lot of people. And then we had the whole rise of the push pull legs rotation come in, and like you said, a lot of people. I think the way they were approaching it wasn't really effective because a lot of people weren't recovering, and a lot of people were missing out on progress that could be made with the way that they were approaching it. So then I think as a result of that, PPL got a lot of backlash in the community. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
if you saw that, but
Yeah.
then now higher frequency comes back into play, and my initial thought process has been it's very heavy on progressive overload, and it's a matter of okay, well, obviously, if you train something more often, the number is going to go up, right? But how important is that really in terms of hypertrophy? Because a lot of things that people are saying, when you look at what is being programmed, it is very high on progressive overload, and the numbers going up. But that's kind of almost in the same sense the way that powerlifters train, right? But
Mm-hmm.
powerlifters aren't big; they aren't getting a ton of muscle, so it's like is there what is really that important also because you noted why the higher frequency does matter aside from just that at neural adaptation of strength, it's this growth process that you're stimulating, which
Potentially.
I yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's not going to be the best approach for everyone. It was
Mm-hmm.
just, if you looked across, like I said, the landscape of training programs, it seemed like in large part a higher frequency regime that made sense. And one thing that popped out at me at what you were just saying is that auto regulation. So if PPL is not working for someone and someone says, well, I need to train 10 to 20 sets per week, and that's just how it is. So I'm going to use 20 because, more is better. Right. And they're not auto
Yeah.
regulating. Like, I've been around a little while, a few hot minutes. Right. And things always pendulum back and forth. And
Mm-hmm.
especially now with social media, the pendulation is more rapid because someone
Yeah.
claims something or someone has something they want to sell or whatever, and people latch on to that. And instead, if I think a smarter way to go about it is to recognize this biological individuality, realize that when volume is equated, frequency doesn't, in all the studies at least, doesn't make a difference. I mean, there's some studies where there's been a difference. It seems like 2 times a week it comes out as being a sweet spot in meta-analytical data. But you don't, if you look at what bodybuilders are doing, like very few of the ones that have actually been in the studies where they've inquired about training are training that often, right?
Mm-hmm.
So why is that? Well, maybe that's because the people who end up being on stage bodybuilders are the ones who have the best genetics, kind of for the reason I suggested. But many people who are listening to this and are on Instagram maybe are not. Or who knows, if you're someone like Phil Heath, the Gift, right? He's called that for a reason. Um, and many pros who are they grow just by sniffing the iron. Like literally, they have such good genetics. Almost everything works. It makes it very very difficult because they don't have any extra improvements to be made. They're already so good to figure out what might be more optimal. And for them, it may not even matter.
Yeah.
That's facetious that they sniff the iron, but for them, they could train once a week. They could train 3 times a week with reduced volume per training session, whatever. When you stress the muscle under load, one of the primary adaptations or a very marked adaptation for them is muscle growth, muscle hypertrophy. It's not. There are some scientists that argue that muscle hypertrophy is just sort of an after effect. It's not really a primary mechanism when you look at what happens, what the adaptation really involves to strength training, to resistance training. And in large part, the amount of strength that you gain over the first 2, 3, 4 years of training isn't something that can be attributed to increased muscle size. You're not tripling your muscle mass or physiological cross-sectional area, but you may be tripling your strength. So to answer another part of what you asked about, I think, is if, as far as progressive overload, if you, and I tell people this, if you don't have to train like a powerlifter. Powerlifters are trying to get 1 rep maxes. And they're also intentionally, and this goes into the topic of mind-muscle connection, they're also intentionally, with the exercises they do, trying to use as much muscle mass as possible. And they're not, a lot of them aren't doing, sometimes they train this way, but they're not going above 10 reps in most cases.
No, but they use the higher frequency approach because, they
right,
get the adaptation quicker.
In terms of neural adaptations, yeah, for sure. It's a practice effect to some degree.
Yeah.
It's hard. Like Brad Schoenfeld had a study where they tried to train with like sets of 3. There's like 3 sets of 10, or I think 3 sets of 7 actually. I think they tried to equate volume versus 3 sets of 10. So 7 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 10, and the size gains were equivalent. But anecdotally, the guys who were doing the triples were a wreck. They were just a wreck. They were just exhausted. So there's a categorical difference between how powerlifters train because of the rep range than what bodybuilders do. And if you train like a bodybuilder, it seems like there's advantages to doing sets of 5 or 6, right? You get that strength that can carry over to doing higher rep sets. But all in all, 5, 6 is pretty much the lower limit. It seems like what's going to produce muscle growth, and you can go all the way up to sets of 30. There's maybe a disadvantage there in terms of how you recover from that. But if you turn yourself into the guy in the gym or the woman in the gym who's outlifting everybody in those rep ranges, right? So you're doing sets of 405 incline on incline bench for 10 reps. Well, you're going to have a chest that looks phenomenal, right? Yeah. So, but the thing is that if you look, like, name the pro bodybuilder. Like, there are many of them. I just heard Ronnie Rockel talking about this. There's a podcast in German when he was really strong. Another German bodybuilder. These guys, a lot of these big guys, incline bench press is one. Dennis James. You can watch them all do this. Ronnie Coleman.
Strong.
They're strong. There are exceptions. Paul Dillett didn't train that hard. It seems like Flex. I didn't saw Flexer Wheeler do anything impressive, but Chris Cormier. Say what?
Kai Green was the overhead pressing 404.
Right.
It's 405, 495 for reps. It was
insane. There's Kevin Levrone doing the same thing on the Smith machine. So if you have the genetics to get yourself that strong in that rep range, then it's going to some degree manifest in muscle growth. It's not a perfect 1-to-1 correlation. You'll see guys that are like the guy that goes out by Anatoly. He actually is a power lifter. He's the one that goes in the gym and acts like he's a janitor. Yeah. And he freaks people out because he's crazy strong. He's got a really good physique. He just covers it up, right? He's just not this big, round, muscle belly bodybuilder. And so there are going to be exceptions. Another guy who went by, I want to say he went by Spider. No. It was a power lifter. Anyway, another guy was like a crazy deadlifter. He could deadlift like 4 times his body weight or something. So those will be exceptions. But all in all, that's one thing. If you take someone and say, okay, let's get to where you're incline pressing 1.5 on a barbell, 1.5 times your body weight for 10 to 12 reps, you're going to look impressive. So that's basically, if you can get there by progressively eating and becoming the biggest version of yourself. Powerlifters are also trying to, it's a relative strength they're looking for too. So that's something that falls into this. You get the guys who are genetically gifted to be really strong pound per pound, and then they try to optimize their strength to weight ratio. They're not trying to be as big as humanly possible, right? And and at the larger end, they're the more body fat's fine because they're already above the 275 limit or whatever. So sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I guess my question here would be, if we're focusing on trying to utilize a higher frequency approach per se, but then also, we're trying to get to that, let's say 405 for benching 10 reps, because obviously you're going to have a big chest. What is really like the order of importance here? Because then we also have fatigue, right? And obviously the more reps that we do, we're going to build more fatigue. I think fatigue has like been this super demonized concept on social media. I feel like it's a much bigger deal than people make it out to be, but people are always talking about it. If we do this much, we're going to have too much fatigue, not going to be able to recover, which you don't know you're going to recover from unless you try it, right? Yeah. But what is really the order of importance, like how fast we get to that 405 by trying to do, let's say, stay with a lower rep range and try to get a more frequency of benching more chest work into, like, say you want to bring up your chest, or is it giving more time and maybe splitting it up 5 days apart and hitting the higher rep range, getting more volume? And I guess the answer is probably just going to come down to the person, right?
It's interesting. It does come down to the person. And if you have like a strategy that I would suggest sometimes to someone who isn't a bodybuilder, who's not making the progress that let's say he wants to make, but if you look at his lifts, he's not a very strong guy, right? He's never really gone to lower rep ranges. He just doesn't do that. He tends to be kind of a pumping type of bodybuilder. That's someone I might say, you know what? Like, hey, you're 29, you got a few years left to compete. Why don't you do a powerlifting meet? Try to get as fucking amazingly strong as you can. Just become a brute. And powerlifters have a very different perspective on this. They just go and they eat, and they're throwing mayo on everything and never drinking water. It's got to have calories in it, and so they will, some of that body dysmorphia that bodybuilders have, which I think holds them back from putting on the size that they need. You don't want to become just a blob, but getting beyond single digit body fat percentage sometimes is just what has to happen en route to getting more muscle mass. So in that case, for someone like that, yeah, you might say, yeah, just get strong. You need to just get brutally strong, and then bring that back in and start training more like a bodybuilder. And I mean, you might be like Larry Wheels, Larry Wheels example, or look at Johnny Jackson's legs, right? Mm-hmm. Johnny Jackson's like, he could squat with just about anybody. He could squat with Ronnie, but his legs were a weak part, relatively speaking. People say, oh, Johnny's got no legs. Like, no, he doesn't have no legs. His legs just aren't as massive as the rest of him. But he was someone who got strong as heck, but it just wasn't the way. Stan Efferding, Johnny's main competitor for World's Strongest Bodybuilder, would change up his training dramatically. He would train Flex Wheeler, and you can find these videos on YouTube. He was doing everything in super high rep ranges, right? So he was training much more like a bodybuilder. He already had that strength, but he was already using massive weights. So for someone who's lacking in strength and they haven't been progressing in the strength, I think there could be something to capture there. Maybe if only to create that neurological gain, and now they can handle heavier weights and they can load the muscle and evoke the hypertrophy. So,
okay.
So that's one aspect, but you could have someone on the other side, right, who's super, super strong, and they like to do low weight stuff. And someone's strong, they like to go in and like, hey, I'm going to go, I'm going to do a 7-plate squat because everyone's going to watch me when I do it. And they like doing that shit. But what if you're like Fred Hatfield? Remember the Fred Hatfield, Tom Platz squat off? He was before your time, but I know you're talking about. That's when I think it was 21 reps that Platz got with 500 or 505, whatever it was. And Hatfield got like 7 or something like that. But Hatfield out squatted him on the 1 rep max by hundreds of pounds. It was like 700 to 900 or something like that. Wasn't even close. So I think,
what do you accredit that to?
Training specificity. Tom would go, Tom used to, the lore is Tom would set the kitchen timer for 10 minutes. And I think he threw like 2 1/4 on the bar and he would just squat the entire time. He wouldn't put the bar down for 10 minutes. So he had massive metabolic adaptations, and also psychologically. I mean, and yes. I think Fred was a smoker too. So that probably didn't help. He probably gassed out, as well, but he never trained in those higher rep ranges. So psychologically, and I think there's a neurological adaptation that comes with that, and a strong psychological one. You learn how to do that, right? And then of course there's the local muscular adaptations. So those are all the components of specificity of training. You train with higher reps. That's why when you look at the studies that have compared heavy load with light load, and you see on average equivalent muscle growth, but you get strength gains that outweigh, you can get strength gains with the higher rep training, but you get the strength gains that are much, much greater during the heavy load training, because it's specific to heavy load training. You're training in 8 to 12 rep range, you're doing a 1 rep max. But if you're training with 20 plus reps, you're so far away from that, you didn't come close to touching those weights. So you don't have the neurological adaptations because you didn't do it. You don't get better at something you don't practice. Kind of simple as that. Yeah.
two completely different approaches. Now,
Yeah.
when you are having somebody train, say somebody that, let's just get brutally strong, doing that higher frequency approach, are you still utilizing training to full all out failure in those scenarios, or are they using more of an RIR type of approach?
So when I wrote the book, RER didn't exist. That wasn't a term yet. So let me explain what I've done, because I think for this, and this is Fortitude training, somewhat generic in a way, but it's tailorable. So I created a system that could be suited to someone who really likes heavy, brutal training, and they can train in heavy. Or if someone finds that the heavy training doesn't do much for them, they can't get a good mind muscle connection, they just start using all sorts of accessory muscles rather than the target muscle, they could train a little bit lighter. So there are 3 set types. There are loading sets, which are just basic straight sets. There are the muscle rounds, which is a cluster set. And I stole that from Leo Costa, the term. I formalized how to do it. So you can use a progressive overload scheme, which I suggest most people do in some way, but it's a little more loosey-goosey. You don't have to do the same exercise week after week. I tell people, just keep a log in your logbook and come back to an exercise that you previously done and beat your past best, right? So you can rotate those. You can auto-regulate depending on what you feel like would be best for that day. It's like I've got plenty of upper chest action from what I did the previous chest workout. I don't need to do an incline chest exercise this time. I'm going to do a flat chest exercise, what have you. And then I've got higher rep stuff, which are the pump sets. And those are where you can include partials. If you want to train in the lengthened position, you can do lengthened partials in there. You can do 1.5 reps. You can just do a straight set with higher reps. Although people talk about, that may be something that incurs greater fatigue, I think it also does improve muscle endurance. And the thing I noticed, especially when I first formally started doing Fortitude training, and when other people started doing it, is if you do, for instance, pump sets and you're doing like a leg press between like 20 and 25 reps, and the reps are always continuous. So you're not doing like a Widowmaker, trying to avoid those maximal effort, almost failure, 0 reps in reserve repetitions. You're not accumulating like a million of those. You're not doing like myo reps or Carsten Voitzenoid, what's the name of his? There's a German. I forget the name. That's the author. I forget the name of his system. But it's basically this prolonged Widowmaker. You're doing continuous repetitions, and you just keep tension the entire time. Allow the fatigue to accumulate, but you're keeping in a higher, like a 15 or 20 to 30 rep range. But you can put partials in there. You're getting time under tension depending on the exercise. It's completely up to you. And this is where you can finagle those little angles that hit a muscle group, like on your back, in a way that you didn't previously or haven't been with other exercises. Go ahead.
Is this the failure?
This would go to failure. It actually could be beyond failure. It's auto-regulated, right? So like Jordan Peters, when he did Fortitude training, he didn't want to do any fancy schmancy stuff. He's just like, I'm just going to do a high rep set. And he would just do normal repetitions. He continuous tension the entire time, no pauses. And then he would just go until there was nothing left and he's done. I like to do, like today, I did them for, I'll go back a couple of days, because today I kind of chose the way I did some new exercise and I went too light. I was trying to watch out for a bad wrist. But you can do 21s. So I actually did, I called them 30s. So I did this on a belt squat. So I did 10 full repetitions, and then I did 10 partials at the top, 10 partials in the middle, and then tried to get 10 partials at the bottom. Next time I'll probably reverse that, because I'll be fresher and the bottom of the range of motion is more difficult. And I'll do 10 full reps, 10 partials, and then 10 partials in the middle and 10 partials at the top, and then try to hold it as long as I can. So it's basically till negative failure, and then I come out of there.
So then what's the difference between the loading set, a straight set, versus pump sets, right? Because straight sets, you just say I do 80 pounds for 2 sets in a row, go to failure with all those sets, right?
The load, you're doing between 6 and 12 reps. The pump
so you had
the pump sets are any configuration you want. You can do 20 to 30 reps with a much lighter load. So we've got this is the nice thing about this. We've got heavy stuff with the loading sets. The loads you choose for muscle rounds are in between, and the loads for the pump sets are light. And one thing that helps with, if you look at the research too on like creating a mind muscle connection, once you get above about 80% of a 1 rep max, if you test people, you say, okay, do this bench press with your triceps or do this bench press with your pecs. And they can do that at lighter loads. Once the weight gets heavy, they can no longer do that. So if you're trying to hit, let's say, low lats, and you just tend to pull with your traps and your upper lats for whatever reason, and you really want to do that, you're going to need to train light enough, especially if you just haven't been training for years and you just can't do that. So what you would do then maybe on a pump set is you would say, I'm going to configure this set. It's a little bit like what John Meadows called a challenge set. But so now you're going to do 1.5 reps. You might do some sort of like a high angle pull down underhand. You go down into that deep position where you can really activate the lower lats and do a half repetition, and then go back up to the full, and then come back do a half repetition and do 1.5 reps. And you might do 15 of those, and because they're 1.5 reps, that's more like 22.5 reps or something. So it's those. So that's at that lighter end, but it has to be auto-regulated. Some people find the pump sets are the hardest part of the whole thing, because you can keep doing partials and like you can do them and say, I'm just going to hang in here and until I die, right? And you're just like with that squat thing, I could just sit down there and just like bounce around for like a half an hour, but I don't do that because I'm like I'm going to be whacked. I need to come back and train legs again 2 or 3 days later. Right. Yeah. So those are auto-regulated, and they're chosen to basically to fill in the spaces where you haven't been able to hit muscles or where they may be weaker, to train a mind-muscle connection. And you also get psychologically and I think metabolically some endurance improvement. So when you go back then to like a 10 rep set, and on loading sets, you only take the last one to failure. One of your questions was about reps in reserve. You do, depending on the volume tier, X number of loading sets. On the compound exercises, where if you fail, you're trapped with hopefully safety bars in place. You're the spotter, right? You only take that last one to failure. But when you do that set and it takes you 22 seconds, that's psychologically a breeze compared to the leg press that you did that lasted a minute and 20 seconds, right? Because you just so it makes those easier. Right. And then when you come back to the pump sets, it's like, well, this is light as shit. I'm going to just dominate this shit for the next 70 seconds or whatever. So there's some reciprocity between the heavy training and the lighter training that I think is something that creates a novelty of effect, which I think we mentioned yesterday the first part. And that's, I think, what the key feature of what progressive overload is. It's an overload. And you can actually note what you did on those pump sets. If someone wants to progressively over everything, I think he actually logged the pump sets too. But you don't have to, as long as you're auto-regulating them, right? So you'll learn. Like if you just destroy yourself on the pump sets, right? And then you come the next day would typically be muscle rounds, and you're like, okay, that was too much. Then you just drop down a volume tier and you do less because you know better. If you're training smartly. So that's the feature that you don't have in a lot of these programs. You don't sleep the night before, you had to go to ER because someone got sick or whatever it might be. And but you want to train because your schedule doesn't permit you to shift things around. Then you need to be able to wing it a little bit, and you can just drop a volume tier and continue from there. So
I like this because it sounds like it's really more so, like you said, it's the reciprocity thing. It's kind of just looking at the bigger picture of everything, and this complements this, and it helps. It's not necessary, because I think a lot of people look at things like very one track minded and see like, oh, why would I do a pump set, when I could just limit that fatigue, and like, is there any really benefit to doing the higher rep, focusing on the pump? But what we're saying here is like, that's going to complement this in the long run. It all plays a factor, right? Like, you're not having these higher rep pump sets in there just for the sole fact of like, this is directly a better stimulus for hypertrophy,
Yeah, well, that's the thing. We know both high rep and low rep can produce muscle growth. There's a really interesting study. I hope we see it done like in maybe a more relevant population. It was a Carniera 2022, I think, and it was with postmenopausal women. They're just looking at fat-free mass, or maybe it was LBM muscle or fat-free mass. And they compared a light load with a heavy load regime, trained for 12 weeks, took 2 weeks off, and they switched. And they had in both groups some people who grew really well. So some women put on a substantial amount of muscle mass and some didn't. So either way, some did really well with the light load and some did not so well, and some did really well with the heavy load and some did not so well. When they switched, those who were relative non-responders became responders when they went to the other loading regime. So if low load didn't work and they went to higher load, they got better adaptation in the second half of the study, the next 12 weeks. Well, you would expect if it doesn't make a difference, if it's all the same, the law of diminishing returns would say, well, if you're not going to grow, you're not going to grow. You go from heavy to light. So what? You're going to just have diminishing gains, all the way out to the 24-week period from 12 to 24. But it wasn't the case. And those individuals, there was diminished gains for the people who grew well in the first half, but they also continued to grow. So you can grow beyond just 12 weeks. Obviously, you keep going for 24 weeks. The longest study I've seen is like 6 months.
I definitely do think there's different approaches that work for everybody. Higher volume, higher reps versus lower reps, and especially at different times. Like what works best for you right now may not be the same in a year. But I ask these things just because I know how the way people think, and what people think right now in the state of the industry, and everybody pretty much is at a point where I don't know if you keep up with this stuff. At least from what I see on a lot of my feed is just people demonizing higher reps and all that stuff. Because it's why would we do that? Yeah, why would we do that if we could get the same? Sure, we get the same hypertrophy out of anything, but if we could get the same hypertrophy with less fatigue, why would we do the higher reps? But then, like you're saying here, it has other benefits maybe outside of just that, and then helping establish that mind muscle connection, transferring them to getting more effective sets out of those loading sets and whatnot. Another thing is also I don't know how you feel about what do you call them, activation rounds, going into a workout using those lighter loads to try to activate your lats so that when you go into those first loading sets you can execute those more effectively. I do that a ton.
Pretty fatiguing. Let me go back to the question of why would you train with lighter reps when it's less efficient in terms of the relative stimulus that you get in the context of the recovery inroads. If we take this Carniera study, let's say it gets replicated and we start to see there's a pattern here and the pattern would be that people who don't respond well from heavy training respond better from light training. That's what that study says, right? And the people who don't respond so well for light training respond better from heavy training. That's the reason why. On average, but we have this Gaussian, this normal distribution curve. Some people are going to respond better from some things than others. The thing I was starting to say is that whether or not you grow, it's not like you resistance train and just your body has no other choice but to hypertrophy the skeletal muscle that you trained. It's a relatively speaking, it's a minor adaptation given the strength gains and the performance gains that come. And some people just are genetically predisposed to get a lot of muscle growth, but other people aren't. And you can have non-responders to strength training. They just don't gain any strength either. You can have people who don't respond to aerobic exercise training, which is kind of crazy too, right?
Yeah.
So, but a relative non-responder to heavy training could be a responder to light training. And it works for bringing up weak body parts. So if you think of yourself as not a particularly gifted bodybuilder, all your body parts are weak. So one strategy, this is kind of one reason why I chose to do this Fortitude training is because people weren't training with high frequency. You know that what was it called? There's the GOMAD program, gallon of milk a day, and super squats. You hear the super squats?
Yeah.
And you're training full body 3 times a week.
Yep.
And you're doing Widowmaker squats. And for the people who did that, it was ridiculously effective. But people don't want to do that because you're brutalizing yourself every workout. Those are brutal workouts.
Yeah.
And one more thing before I come back to your question, before I totally forget it, but the overtraining research is really sparse, or it's really poor because it's very, very, very difficult to actually induce a state of overtraining where people actually see, at least with resistance training, a reduction in performance. People just put on the brakes. I think this is a feature of many of these high volume studies there's maybe they document or they say in their methods that we trained a momentary muscular failure, right? But how do you spot check that? Right? How do
Yeah.
you objectively say, okay, we know that person did that? Well, as you like, do we use a surface EMG and say, well, surface EMG, stayed maximal, and then the reps, so the activation, quote unquote, was the same, and then they eventually couldn't move the weight. Well, actually, surface EMG would typically go down during fatigue. There's a phenomenon where you have fatigue. It's called muscle wisdom, and the firing rate goes down because a fatigued muscle is now a slower muscle and it doesn't require the same firing rate. Firing rate goes down, that's less electrical activity. You'd expect it to go down. So that's not going to work. If you try to do, like, if you want to look at relative activation, you can do twitch interpolation. So people are pushing as hard as they can, and you superimpose an electrical stimulus on there. That doesn't pan out. You can show people who are older people who start off with 100% of maximal activation and they're completely untrained, and then they'll gain 50% strength on an exercise in 3 months. It's like, well, how could that be? They're already maximal and they didn't gain 50% muscle mass. So that one's out, right? You could maybe make some measurements in the brain, right? But my point there is that's a difficult thing to test. And let's say at the beginning of a program, when you come in the lab before they're actually doing the training, you say, okay, person X, Billy Bob here, this guy can train hard. He proved it. He trained. We have a method so we can document whether he trained to failure. Now we're going to put him in the 45 sets to failure training group for his legs per week. And he's moving along and he gets to week 4 or 6 and he's like, oh, fuck. I got to hold back. I got to sandbag a little bit. The studies aren't going in and saying, let's document if you trained to failure. People are gonna pull back on the reins so they can survive the training, and you'll see some dissociation between strength gains and muscle gains. In one of Brad Schoenfeld's studies, for instance, there was greater muscle growth in the one that's so highly criticized in the higher volume group, but they didn't gain more strength. So whether it was fluid shifts, that's the thing people always tossed around, but like there can be a dissociation. This doesn't always happen, but between strength. So what's going on if you're going into like the burning building of overtraining, right? People are gonna like start training less hard. They're gonna start faking it. Most people will. To be someone like this is when I went and I did Fortitude training and I stayed at volume tier 3 all the way to like my peak week of my show. And
real quick,
yes, yeah.
What are the volume tiers?
Oh, they're different amounts of volume. A tier is a different level.
What is it?
I have a chart.
Like how much?
I have a chart. How many sets is a pump set where you do 21s? Does it count as one set? Does it count as 2 sets? I don't know.
I would count it as 1 set.
Okay. Well, what if you just do a set of 10 and you got 3 reps in reserve? Is that 1 set? Yeah.
If you assign a set, yeah, it's 1 set.
Okay. So are those the same stimulus wise?
No,
not even close. What if you do a muscle? What if you do a muscle round? I haven't explained this, but it's like a cluster set. It's like
no. I have. We're okay. You can explain it now.
Yeah. Well, DC training rest pause sets. Like a general.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. I was going to try to compare it to rest pause sets versus cluster sets, myo reps.
So rest pause sets. I get asked this question all the time. People are like, well, how many sets is that? It's 3, right? You do 10, 12 reps, and then you go to failure, and then you rest 12, 15 breaths. You go to failure again, 12, 15 breaths, go to failure again, and then you do like a resistive negative or a pulsing negative, right? So is that 3 sets? Does the last one count as a set, or is that 1 set?
Some people say it's 3. I always count it as 1.
But is it the same as just doing 1 set if you didn't do this the last 3 legs?
No,
of course not. So my question is, does it matter? I've only had like there's probably I would guess maybe 20% of the people, maybe 25 of the percent of people who do Fortitude training can actually hang in there at volume tier 3.
Well, that's what I'm saying. What are these volume tiers? Like, what does 3 mean?
You'd have to look at the chart. You can count it up. I mean, I can do it in my head. I can pull it up. I don't know. It's probably less than 20 sets per week.
Okay.
But it varies by muscle group. Each of them, arms aren't trained as much because they get hit on everything else. So here's the thing with the research. If you do a bench press that's tricep training. If you do an overhead press, that's tricep training, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
do a tricep press, that's tricep training. Are those all the same? No.
No.
So you could do fortitude training and do, let's say you train chest, you do a compound exercise and then a fly as your loading sets, and then you do muscle rounds, and all of them are isolation exercises. Um, you do a pec fly, you do a dumbbell fly, and you do no triceps training, right? This is going to work for you. And then you come back and you do all your pump sets are all isolation exercises. But on the other hand, you could choose your exercises differently because you're choosing the exercises. That's the other thing I think there are no prescribed exercises. Your loading sets are those big, badass go-to exercises. There's the obvious ones. Most people are doing some kind of a squatting exercise, some kind of a leg press, some type of a chest press, some kind of an overhead press, but not always. There's the most bang for your buck exercises that people would do, but it's up to you and you're rotating through them. So it changes week by week because your exercise selection changes and the overlap changes. So that's the problem with the research literature. If you look at, like a lat pull down is one set for biceps. Well, not if you're doing it right. Right? It's not. That's just silliness. But that's what they got to do. If you do a pull up, a chin up, those can hit the biceps pretty hard just because just the nature of the exercise and stabilization because your body's, free in space. But if you do, like I have an exercise where you can take those hang ups those ab straps and there's well, you probably wouldn't know this machine, but you take and hook those under your elbows and you drive down like this and it takes your biceps out. It's a good exercise. Yeah. And that's an all lat exercise, but it's a pull down exercise. Your biceps.
Yeah, they have the.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say they have like the converging diverging Panada machine, and basically you're coming out, and you basically just feels all lats in that machine,
right? But
not,
But that's a pull down machine, right? So that would count. So I don't know. I've never even added it up because I just have to give a range, and it really doesn't matter. That's the thing. It's good you asked that question. I should probably go and do that. But it doesn't make a difference.
Trying to see what you're referring to.
Yeah. Well, there's a sheet. It's a free download. It's not like hidden behind a paywall or whatever. You can go download that. The overhead.
I'll put it over this.
Yeah. The overview sheets are free, and you can see. And there's different set types. You train quads, for instance, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. If you set it up typically, day 1, day 2, and day 3, and how many sets you do. Like if you do volume tier 1 for quads, you would do a compound exercise and then an isolation exercise. You do 2 exercises that day for loading. But then you might come back and do leg press pump set 2 days later. And that could be a leg press where you're doing like 21s. And then you could do 21s on a knee extension exercise, maybe another isolation exercise.
Were you close with John
Meadows? Yeah, absolutely.
Because it sounds like a lot of the way he programmed is kind of like I'm picking up things that are similar to the way that I've seen his programs.
His 2.0 programs, we talked a lot, and he started adding more frequency, and that was the result of our conversations.
It's the pump sets too, all that stuff. Cluster sets, pump sets, all those things.
Mm-hmm.
Is a cluster set is the same thing as muscle round?
A cluster set is the term people sometimes just use muscle round. A cluster set is a discontinuous set. So, and they can be done multiple ways. So a rest pause set. Dante actually took that term from Mike Mentzer, and he was, yeah. I mean, he gives him credit, right? He didn't steal it from him, like try to be sneaky. He said that 1,000,001 times, but that's where the term originated. But the way he sets them up, you pick a weight, you can lift roughly, you can use different rep ranges, but you would go to failure once, 10 to 12 reps, take about 12 deep breaths, go to failure again. There might be 4 reps or so, another set of breaths. Then you go to failure again. And then typically you would also then do a negative. So you have a partner lift the weight up for you. You would start in the upper position and you'd try to hold the weight as long as you can. And that's one set. That's one with my reps. I'll butcher his name, but Borg Fairley.
I had him on the last episode.
Okay. So that's another type of cluster set. Carsten Voitzenreuter, I forget the name of his books in the other room. But he's got these, you can Google him if people can figure out how to spell his name. And his sets are just brutal. They're like Widowmakers. Those aren't kind of cluster sets. They're discontinuous. In muscle rounds, you're doing sets of 4 with about 5 breaths or 10 seconds in between. And you pick a weight where you're going to get at least 3 of those without failing. And you fail on the 4th, the 5th, or the 6th. And you only do a total of 6 sets. So if you want to
Yeah.
go heavy, you pick a weight where you're going to fail on that 4th one. And then you drop down so you complete the other 2 sets of 4, just barely at least. Those are still then effective reps. So you accumulate lots of effective reps in here when you do, especially after you drop back down. If you want to train more lighter, you would pick a weight where you get 5 sets of 4, and then you would fail on the 6th one, maybe near the end. So you have some variability depending on the exercise, whether you train lighter or heavier, what your druthers are. But those discontinuous sets, the cluster sets, allow you then to come closer to failure, so have more effective reps or effective time under tension, and then take a break, recover, pick up the same weight or maybe a reduced weight. I set that up with 1 failure point on purpose. There's a reason for that. And I kept it always, even if you fail early, you still do the other sets. So your volume is about the same. So have a volume unit per muscle round. We're not going to say it's worth 3 sets or worth 2 sets or worth 4 sets. It's 4 sets of 4. The last one could be more than 4. If you go into the 6th one and you haven't failed yet, and you go to failure, just so you know how to change the weight the next time. But that discontinuity allows you to recover and then get effective reps in those in the sets that happen after that, or the segments of the rest pause set, or whatever the cluster set is. So that's what Dante's does very effectively. They're all to failure in his case. In mine, it's not.
Yeah, that's how I always did cluster sets. I originally got that from John because that's how I saw him program them. Was exactly how you said. There's sets of 4, and it's probably from one of those programs I had years ago that I'm sure you were in communication with him a lot. Yeah. So, but I started leaning more towards the rest pause set because the rest pause set you go to failure. I always like to just train super hard, brutally. So I always felt like holding back a little bit on those. But what would you say the primary benefit is over doing that over something like a rest pause where you're going to failure continuously because you're like saving reps in reserve until you get I mean you're doing four reps, so you're saving reps in reserve, but you're only waiting till like that last round to go to failure.
So if you look, and this is one of the sections you want to talk about, there's this new meta regression that came out from Mike Zordo's lab. One of his grad students did it's a pretty cool study that sort of suggested that the relative hypertrophic effect you get increases all the way up to failure. But if you look at the literature, all in all, when you compare volume equated studies, failure to no failure, you get the same amount of growth. So what actually means, what is a stimulating rep or an effective rep? Is it the last 5 reps of a set? Well, maybe. It's hard. It's going to depend on the person. For some people, because of how trained they are, how advanced they are, law of diminishing return applies here. Only the last 2 reps of a set might be worth anything to them. If they start cutting, leaving 3 reps in the tank, that's not doing shit for them. They're just going to have to train harder. So, at any rate, we have this idea of effective reps. But what I've noticed, and I learned a long time ago, this is more of an empirical thing. And actually, there is a study that substantiates this, just came out not too long ago, is that failure rep, that failure effort, or maybe even the rep when you're at 0 reps reserve, and then the next one is when you fail. That one is stimulating, but it seems to have a much larger impact on your recovery. So if you go to 1 rep in reserve, and let's say that rep before that and that rep, those were stimulating, and you might get a large percentage of what you got in terms of stimulus. You get more if you go to failure, but then you have a greater inroad into recovery. It's more fun to train that way and hit failure each time. And sometimes you just may have to, right? Sometimes once you're getting advanced, you may just have to train to failure. And the other thing with training to failure is if you haven't trained to failure, then you don't know that you're actually how close you really are. You have to
be the thresholds.
You don't, unless you really train to failure, like there's a gun to your head. When you say, I have to get this rep, or otherwise, I mean, there's all sorts of, things you can conjure in your head. Most people aren't sick enough to do that, but training to failure at least that gives you an idea of how close you really are, so you can better gauge that. But the idea is that there is an increased impact on your recovery by training to failure. And what I've done with Fortitude training by limiting the number of failure points is to try to accumulate effective stimulating time under tension. They call the effective reps. That term wasn't available when I came up with the session or with the system. But you do that, but you limit the number of those sets where you actually go to failure, because those are the ones that really whack your recovery. So try to train with an enhanced amount of volume with some failure points, because you do get more bang for your buck out of those, I think, potentially stimulating wise, but you also can make inroads into your recovery. And it's nice to know that's your check on yourself, right? It's important for progressive overload too, I think. Just to know, okay, last time I did my last set, let's say I'm doing 5 sets for my loading sets. And on my last set, everything was the same last time versus this time. And then this time, I got 2 more reps. And I went to failure that time and this time. Then I know for sure. If I were holding back, it's like, well, I may have gotten another rep just because I went to really 1 rep in reserve as opposed to 2. I just wanted to beat the logbook. So I just tried harder. But if you went to failure, you tried as hard as you could, and now you progressed. So the failure point allows you to more effectively apply progressive overload. But if you throw them all in there, it's an easier thing to overdo. And I think it makes sense to have some optimization in terms of gathering that effective time under tension and not overdoing the failure points, but having them there so you can actually gauge your progressive overload. That's why I have when you're lifting the weight. In all cases, even during the muscle rounds, when you're actually doing those sets of 4, the repetitions are continuous. During the pump sets, the repetitions are continuous. During the loading sets, it's very hard to do this because everyone wants to, when they're getting close to failure, they're like, okay, I want to stop. You take another breath and then you do again. And that's how a Widowmaker is done. And you know what Widowmakers are from DC training?
It's when you're stopping, you go continuously, then you stop. And then you continue to do more. I have guys do this on leg presses, and it fucking kills them.
It just destroys you. So it's drastically. I think it's good psychologically because you learn how to push yourself harder, but it does it can really whack you pretty bad because you're accumulating numerous 0 reps in reserve efforts. You get to where the next rep would be failure, and then you stop. Or like if you really strategize it appropriately, you go up to maybe 2 reps in reserve, and if you stop then and you rest 5 seconds, you're gonna get 4 reps the next time as opposed to just 3 if you only rested 2 seconds. So you learn how to go to 10 or 12 and then rest and then 2 or 3 more. You don't go right up to 0 reps in reserve because eventually you're gonna just hit the wall. So you can but that is a very effective. I love training that way. What I've done with the continuity is that now you standardize. So one of the things with logbooking is that, and I've seen this. I'll give you an example from there was a power lifter that University of Texas. It was a woman, actually. I don't know her name. I just remember this. I remember it's like, well, okay, this was one that was really clear to me. It stuck out. And at University of Texas at the time, this is Jan and Terry Todd. They're kind of legendary in the powerlifting world. They had coached, I don't know, they had won 8 or 9 of the last 10 NCAA powerlifting championships. Their teams were amazing. And this woman was one of the best powerlifters on the team, the best, maybe the best female they had. And she was a ridiculously good squatter. And they would do sets of 10 for 3 or 4 weeks, and sets of 5 for 3 or 4 weeks, and then sets of 3. And everyone followed the kind of the same program. They'd sort of periodize in that way. And they would try to increase the weight during those weeks too, right? Because you're trying to get stronger as you go along. And what she was doing, I remember watching her do this set, and she was supposed to do a set of 5, and she did a single, and then she stood there with it. And then she did a single, and her set of 5 took it must have taken well over a minute.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, that's not a 5 rep max. When she was doing
no.
So she was increasing the weight, but she was changing your set execution because she's putting all those gaps in there. So if you're training along and now you start resting and make your set discontinuous like that, you're doing that's what a Widowmaker is about, is to take great advantage of that property. But now you're progressing on the logbook, and your progression is not reflective of muscle growth. It's reflective of your set strategy,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now your logbook, the logbook, if everything else to some extent is supposed to be equal, you want the strength to be coming from more muscle mass. There's always going to be neurological impact there, but you want to make
Yeah.
that reflective of. That's why, for instance, with the loading sets, you rotate between 3 different groupings of exercises. So you're not like doing a Hammersmith standing squat every week, because if you don't typically do those every week, you're going to just get better at that because you're practicing it more regularly. But if you only do that every 3 weeks, then when you come around to that each time, you don't have a practice. You may never do that except once every 3 weeks. Then whatever gains you're getting, assuming you're just not learning the exercise for the first time, are going to be, theoretically at least, and this seems to pan out pretty well, going to be more reflective of muscle mass that you gain, assuming the scale is moving upward, your body composition is shifting the right way, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
if you keep the reps continuous, then it prevents those 0 reps in reserve, Widowmaker style, destroy your nervous system type of thing. Like you're like, oh shit, I'm just totally whacked. I can keep my eyes open when I go home. It's very difficult to do because I've always likened it to it's like you're walking off a cliff. You're walking,
Yeah.
I see the failure rep coming, right? And there's only one at the end. So the compound exercises where typically you need to have a rack to be in or a spot or whatever, those you only take the last one to failure. The others are 1 or 2 reps in reserve. That's kind of your call. I just called them reps in the tank at the time, I think. The isolation exercise, like say you're doing a knee extension, you can go take those to failure. Those are okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you can watch progressive. So you might have what you do with loading sets, for instance. And this creates a practical problem in the gym sometimes for people because they have to commandeer multiple exercises. It's not the big deal. You can make it work in many cases. I have solutions on my discussion board, but you would do a squat, like so your highest volume, so you do a squat, a knee extension, a squat, a hamstring curl, and a squat. And you might do all 5 of those sets 1 week and get X number of reps for the different exercises. And the only thing you progress on is the knee extension. That's progress. Keep going.
Yeah.
Come back again 3 weeks later, you do the same progression. And this time, everything else is the same except you progress on the hamstring curl just by 1 rep. That's progress. And just keep eking that shit out. You keep doing that. You get 1 rep each exercise, for the next year and a half. And next thing you know, you've gotten 5 reps on each of those exercises. So you probably have changed the weight by that time. But you can eke that out. So, but by taking those to failure and there's still some wishy-washiness there because there's still some reps in reserve. There's still some, like the first couple sets, but that just isn't practical. If you're doing a squat and you take the first set to failure, and you've got like 7 plates, like, oh shit. Like, well, there's that too. Like you substantially
workout's over.
You're done. Like, and that's what this study I was going to mention. Like there was this study out of that Eric Helms was a part of, I'm not sure if it was from his lab or not, but they compared like 2 reps in reserve versus failure training and equal hypertrophy under both conditions. But the actual volume of training was less with those who trained to failure because they got less reps. They did 1 leg one way and 1 leg the other way, I think on a leg press. And they just got fewer reps. Once they hit failure, then they would drop like three reps the next set, as opposed to if they stayed a couple reps shy of failure, they could keep their reps pretty high. So they actually end up doing fewer repetitions because of the failure. So yeah, once you're done, like once you fail on then what are you going to do? Like strip it down, like and then hope you can slide your ass under there and crank it back up, or you have to bring 4 people over to push it up. It doesn't work. So practically, but you're getting a lot of the effective reps out of that, and you're saving your nervous system and everything else that happens when you hit failure like that. So
you brought up some good points that I think a lot of people don't realize. I really try to hammer this constantly, is that most people really don't know how to train that hard. This is one of the problems that I do see with the reps in reserve, which obviously it makes sense to have in place, but a lot of these guys, especially you're newer in the gym, can't effectively gauge that, I don't think, at least. And I coach people. I get form feedback videos every week, multiple every day, and it's just like, okay, usually it's like, okay, maybe you had 1 more in you, but in a lot of cases it's like you had like 8 more reps in you. Like this is not even remotely close to failure. Those guys who don't have that much experience in the gym, and even some people who do, like train for 5 years. It's like, how have you been training for 5 years and they still like have never really pushed themselves? And I was lucky enough to, when I was younger, I had older guys that would come bring me in the gym and just put me through the most torturous shit ever.
Right.
You know, they would put 225 on the squat bar. I've talked about this a lot, and I couldn't even squat 225. They'd do 20 reps and like do those Widowmaker type sets. Like, you're done. No, and like keep picking me up over and
Yeah.
over. It was absolutely terrible, fry my nervous system, but it taught me what real failure was. It taught me how far you could go. I mean, I throw up after the first set of a workout, and
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask you this too, because I ask this to everybody, because there is a lot of controversy over this, at least in the younger generation. And I've said this before, is if you've never actually thrown up during a leg workout, you don't know how to train legs hard. How do you feel about that?
I have thrown up during leg training. Um, Black and white. I don't think there's anything black and white,
Not black
but
and white, just in a general sense.
I think there's something. I know people who puke really easily, but I think
Yeah.
that's one of those, like, let me beat my chest and say what a badass I am, because like, what if you throw up every time? It's like, what's wrong with your, like,
No,
you got a weak stomach? But yeah, there's some truth to that. I'll say that much.
I
Right?
think it's just like if you've pushed yourself to that extent, if you've hit that threshold, the majority of people would have experienced throwing up at that point,
Yeah.
and then you like kind of gauge off
Mhm.
of that. No,
There's something to say for someone who pushes so hard that there's an autonomic revolt where they vomit, right? So yeah, for
yeah,
sure. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't want to. You don't like. I'm not big on, like, saying like you need to push until you throw up.
no. I
But
just say because I see people. Obviously, you see people train all the time too, and everybody thinks that they train very hard, of course, obviously. And I made this statement before, and there was a lot of controversy about it. So I just ask everybody that comes to the podcast, and
mhm,
most coaches will say, yeah, if you've never thrown up at least once during a leg workout, your perception of what's hard probably isn't as hard as it could
yeah,
be.
yeah, yeah. I think because what that means, I can answer it this way, maybe more directly, is that what that means is that you've pushed your limits so hard, you push beyond what a comfort level is, to the point where your body is just like, oh shit, what's going on here? Your
Yeah,
sympathetic nervous system, I mean, it's a function of what you ate, what have you. A sympathetic nervous system is so in overdrive that food needs to come out. It's not going to get digested by any means. Um,
hmm
so yeah, that's the thing, is there's like, this is, I'm going into no man's land when you push that hard, where, like, it's just pure sympathetic drive, pure animalistic, like, just
yeah,
releasing the governor. Um,
adrenaline.
it's really can be quite a thrill, and you have to have quite a few screws loose to want to do that on a regular basis.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's another thing is training that way. Like you said, it has this psychological effect when you push yourself to that extent, like with the Widowmaker sets of things.
mhm.
And this is another thing I've noticed with a lot of guys that I have do those types of approaches is they what like you said, from standardizing the execution. A lot of guys from the start will do that. They'll do a leg press and they'll pause at the top for 3 seconds, and they'll do another
Mhm.
one, and it's like, no, this is what you should be doing
They're avoiding the
after.
effort. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, they're avoiding the effort. So this is what you should be doing after you start to fail around 15 reps. Then I want you to start doing this and try to get as many more as you can.
Hmm.
I think it's very hard for a lot of people to understand how to do that unless they've. It's a lot easier to put somebody through that in person and show them that way
Yeah.
versus trying to convey it online and have somebody do it themselves, because it's torturing yourself if you've never even been through that.
Yeah. I mean, we're social animals, so having external motivation, someone there looking over you who you're trying to prove yourself to, or even a woman can motivate a man because he wants to look, like he's a badass. The thing that I did, knowing that with Fortitude training, now I feel like I'm kind of pumping the system, but um,
Yeah.
the way the sets are set up is that you're going to train as hard as you're willing to, right? And safely. So like that last set on those, like that set taken to failure, that's to your failure, right? And you've also, like, in the scenario I gave you with the squat, knee extension squat, hamstring squat, you've done those 2 sets, which are supposed to be 1 or 2 reps away from failure, right? And then you take it to failure. So you've got your checkpoint right there, right? Did you
Mhm.
really go to, like, was I really 2 reps shy of failure? There's going to be some fatigue. Sometimes you may need to keep yourself in the rep ranges. Like, one way you can do that is you pick a weight, whatever it is, six plates on the hammer strength squat or whatever it is, and you may start off and get 12 reps, which might be a 14 rep max. and you're in a 6 to 12 rep range here. That's the general parameter that I set up for those. And then you have fatigue because you're only resting 2 minutes between each set. So there's a set rest interval as well. This is so you can use your logbook as a metric. You do your knee extension, you come back. The next time you may get 9 reps, right? Because you're fatigued, but you're still rep or 2 shy of hitting your failure point. And then you come back. And then if you get 4 reps, well, then something weird has happened. But if you get 15 reps, well, then you know that those first 2 sets were not anywhere near failure. They weren't as close to failure as you thought. If you really go, but you have to make the reps continuous. And that's for what I think that is, there's a catch-22 here when people do that pausing thing where they're trying to avoid those really effortful reps. It's that last excruciating rep, which on a leg press is like something, especially if you're on like a vertical leg press, when you feel like your consciousness is going to explode, right?
Yeah.
You go right into that. You walk right into it. You keep going. The reps are continuous. There's no pause and there's no nothing. You've got continuous tension. The burn in your legs, wherever you're feeling it, stays, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And if you can just say to yourself, I got 10 seconds and I am fucking indomitable. This is going to happen. And you've got a safety set in place so you can actually go to failure. Then you just go. You just go and it's over and it's done with. And it's not like, oh shit. Like, is he going to make me do like five more reps that I can't possibly do? Nope. You just keep going. You keep going. And then you're done. And it's only a matter of 10 seconds. Mainly when you really are like, oh shit, this is extraordinarily hard. Those last 2, 3, 4 reps. But that's with that person's, personal parameters of how hard they're willing to train. And that's the thing that governs it all anyway. Because some people could push through that. And some people you're like, Michaela Aycock is? Female bodybuilder?
No.
Okay. She just got second in the Tampa. She lives, I think she lives in Orlando here in Florida. She's a monster. Watch her train. Michaela Aycock, Aycock. Okay. She did they used to have a bros versus pros competition where they'd have the pro bodybuilders compete against amateurs. This was part of RX Muscle. They go around to various places and they have these like squat competitions. One of them was like a body weight squat for reps. And there's a video you can see of her. This was like 8-10 years ago, maybe. And she squatted her body weight like 132 times or something like that. It was just crazy. She's just, you're like, she was stopping, but that's the thing. She was just stopping and she's like, I'll just do another rep. She's just like, the pain is like, whatever it does. Like, she's just like, in fact, I think, and this is the mindset that I have. And if people can take this on, I think it's helpful. It's like, you want the effort. That's the whole point of this. That's the effective rep. Give me that hard shit. That's what I'm here for. Yeah. The rest of it's sort of pissing in the wind. You have a good activation ball. There's probably something to say for accumulating time under tension in those lower threshold activated motor units and those fibers associated with them. So you're getting some volume for the type 1 fibers that they're used at the start of the set, the type 2s, et cetera. But you're looking for that hard rep. That's what you want. It's like, okay, here we go. Here's the finish line. You don't stop. You don't like run the marathon and like, oh no, not the finish line. I'm going to stop now. It's like, no, you burst through that. You're like, yeah, give me that shit. So she's someone, if you watch that, there's another guy whose name is Sarge. He was, what's the guy's name? It was a powerlifter who died, but Sarge, it just went by Sarge. He was like in his 40s and he did a body weight squat. I think it was 198 pounds or maybe it's like a little more than 200 pounds. And he did 98 reps. Right. And you watch him and he's wobbling all around by like rep 70. And the last, I think it took him over 10 minutes and he wanted to get 100 reps. He didn't quite get it. But if you watch people, there's examples of that. There are people just doing this extraordinary things. And most people just aren't wired to do that. But if you do the reps continuous and go to whatever failure is for you, that's all you can do. You just can't get more out of people. So the sets are all set up based on the person's ability and willingness to train to whatever failure is for them.
Okay. Now with the higher frequency, is that approach going to be applicable to every muscle group or is it specific to just weaker body parts?
Everything's trained that way. Basically it's like day 1 and day 2 in the basic setup, it's a full body training. So you would do loading sets. Typically, loading sets for day one would be the lower body, and then you do upper body pump sets. You come back a couple of days later, typically, and you switch that around: upper body loading sets, lower body pump sets, and
How
then
often are rest days?
you train 4 times a week. So you train like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. I'm doing that right now. I just got done. I just did upper body muscle rounds, actually. So you do whole body on Monday, day one, whole body day two, and then you lower body and then upper body. Those are the 4 days. So
Okay.
loading pump sets, muscle rounds, muscle rounds.
And then how do you go about, say you have a weaker body part that you specifically want to bring up, say for an advanced competitor, how do you implement that type of approach?
All sorts of stuff. I got one of the biggest questions to get asked. Actually, I'm not trying to slow people up there. I made a daily trainer. It was called No Show, No Go, where I actually explicitly state which exercises are used. And I took the ingredients of Fortitude training and flip-flopped them around it would have been a men's physique competitor who wanted to bring up, I think, calves and delts and arms, which would be important for that category. So people, if they want to see like everything you can do, that's there. But with the basic Fortitude plan, there are several things you could do. First of all, you got to pick the right exercises for you. So that's super. So don't just do like squats if they don't work, trying to bring your quads up.
Yeah.
The loading sets I call it zigzag. So you go between a compound and an isolation movement. So I gave that example of the squats, knee extensions, squats, hamstring curls, squats. But you can pre-fatigue. So the idea there is that you do the set of squats, and then when you hit knee extensions, you pre-fatigued the quads, so they're going to be more heavily loaded or potentially be your failure point. And there's a body of literature there that's somewhat contentious. But what you could do is do your knee extensions first and then go into your sets of quads. So they're pre-fatigued throughout all the sets that you do. When you do your pump sets, you only got so much overall recovery, right? So if you try to train everything like the 52 set study that came out where they worked their way up to 52 sets, and it was just, they weren't training the rest of the body in the study. It was just that was like the problem with that is that how would you do 52 sets for every muscle group in the body? You couldn't. You just can't do enough. So with the pump sets, you're choosing whether you're just going to do a straight set to failure or you're going to do this diabolical, partials. I have something called fives in the hole, for instance. I just made this. You can make them up as you go. You pick up the weight, like, oh, I like how this feels at this portion of range of motion, and just pump the shit out of the muscle and just try to destroy it. The fives in the hole are 5 full repetitions, 5 partials, 4 full repetitions, 5 partials, 3 full repetitions, 5 partials, 2 full reps, 5 partials, 1 full rep, partials until you can't move the weight anymore. Those are pretty brutal. Those are really fun.
Yeah.
You would do those with those muscle groups that you're really trying to bring up. You would use the most brutal pump sets you possibly could to just destroy them, sort of, quote unquote, force them to grow. The other aspect I haven't talked about is I have stretching involved. So I took the reins from Dante Trudell in DC training and the thing that's so often missed, everyone's talking about training the lengthened position now, is the extreme stretches from DC training where you're stretching under load is tension in the stretch position. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
And that's why he found that those worked, and that's why he included those. So I have stretches in Fortitude training, but I finagled it a little bit, and I have 3 stretch types. So you can do an extreme stretch, just like Dante would, whichever one works for you. So if it's chest, you might take a dumbbell, bring it down to a stretch position, try to hold it there for 60 to 90 seconds, within reason.
Yep.
Or you might do an occlusion stretch is what I called them. So you don't necessarily use a load, but you would get into a stretch position and do an isometric contraction. So, and max effort, or is all whatever you can.
Like PNF.
A little bit like a PNF, but you'd be doing it to yourself. You wouldn't have something applied. And you could do a PNF and try to contract, but you don't do the relax, because PNF is typically contract, relax. This is just contracting the entire time. So let's say you're really trying to bring up your upper chest. In this case, you might find whatever an implement in the gym somewhere, so you can get a stretch that stretches the clavicular aspect of your pec and the upper sternal, so the upper chest, upper pec, and then you contract and you hold and you get into that deep stretch and you finagle this. I'm really big on the stretches being intuitive. So, you can stretch like one hamstring and externally rotate and try to hit the biceps femoris a little bit more or what have you. You can finagle the stretch based on how you position yourself to stretch different aspects of muscles. And you also do have voluntary control over where you activate a muscle. So you can just turn on the upper part of your pec. You can just turn on the bottom part of your pec. So you can then you're actually that if you have a weight in your hand, you're constrained by whichever way gravity is pushing the weight and how you have yourself set up. But you can finagle yourself into a position where you intentionally stretch and contract the aspect of the muscle you're trying to bring up. So and those are brutal. Go to town on those. And then the muscle rounds, those exercises are auto regulated, auto selected. So you choose whatever you want to do. You might also, let's say you're going to do 2 muscle rounds for your pecs on a particular day, depending on what volume you're at. You might do both isolation exercises and make sure that you find the ones that really work for you. Like I've got an exercise, you can find a video on it called incline scoop fly used with a dumbbell. That's a brutal exercise. As long as you have good solid shoulders, you don't tend to biceps tendonitis in your shoulders. It's brutal exercise for the upper pecs. Just crazy. So you can choose exercises that are at least pre-fatiguing. So maybe for quads, you want to still do like a leg press, a compound exercise I group thighs together, but you would make sure you choose the exercise. When you do your leg presses, you do them low with the feet close together. So it's more quad focused, right? And then you can look at how the exercise, this came up on my podcast just a couple of days ago, how the exercises overlap. So let's say you want to bring up your arms. You would make sure that you do compound exercises for the delts and the pecs that are involving the triceps. So in the literature, both of those would be tricep exercises. Well, you actually would make them tricep exercises intentionally by maybe keeping your grip a little bit closer. Because your focus, you can't like bring everything up all at once. I mean, that's the ideal world. But if you really say, I'm going to try to hit these things, then you may have to, rob Paul to pay Peter, rob Peter to pay Paul to make that work a little bit. So your exercise selection, how you execute the stretches, how you execute the pump sets, pre-fatiguing with isolation movements, both with the muscle rounds and the loading sets. Once you do all those things and found the right exercises, that's super, super important. And there's, employ a mind-muscle connection. Those are things outside of Fortitude training. Make sure you initiate the exercise with the muscle. So if you're doing a curl, make sure you don't start by gripping the dumbbell or gripping the bar. You start by activating the biceps, and that will initiate the movement. There's actually a study where they all they had people was do an isometric bicep contraction, no load, and they produced muscle growth just from holding the thing. Like there's zero, there was no load training. It's in the title of the study. Yeah. No load training produces muscle growth. So learning how to activate the muscle in the exercises you've chosen that don't give you any option but to do that. You have to be choosy about that and be inventive sometimes. And then all those other strategies. And by the time you've done that, you can really finagle the heck out of the system to bring up weak muscle groups.
Are you allocating more volume towards the weaker muscle groups and backing off other muscle groups?
That's the thing. You can do that. That's another strategy. So that's the nice thing is I have the volume tiers written out, black and white. So if you stay in one volume tier, then I've allocated the volume across the muscle groups in the way that kind of makes sense, right? But you could say, you know what? More volume isn't always the answer. Sometimes it can be. If a muscle's never getting sore, right, then you may need to do more. If all your other muscles that grow well tend to get sore, and the one muscle that doesn't grow well never gets sore, that's kind of a clue, right? So maybe you train a muscle until you've like, wow, it gets sore, and then you just keep doing like this is a common thing people figure out. They finally figured out how to make their calf sore. When they started doing that, their calf started to grow. Right, that happens.
Started to do what?
Started to grow. They did.
But what were they doing?
Oh, like 100 rep sets or
Okay.
whatever drop sets, like like just standing leg calf raises, and they just 5-stage drop sets, like just crazy shit, right?
Yeah, so
Yeah,
so let's talk about that because there's a lot of controversy about like calves and forearms specifically. People have the most trouble growing them. I've always had trouble growing my calves specifically, and I can tell you what has worked the best for my calves in my experience. And my calves literally have barely grown outside of the time frame where I did this. Where there's a bodybuilder at my gym. His name's Jonathan Withers. I'm not sure if you're familiar
yeah.
with John.
His
It's huge,
legs are
huge fucking legs.
freaky legs. Yeah,
Insane.
I follow
And
him on
as I was
Instagram.
asking, yeah, yeah. How do you get your calves bigger? He's telling me he used to have tiny calves. He said do them 3 days on, 1 day off.
Yeah.
7 sets. I did 3 days on, 1 day off, 3 days on, 1 day off, and I would do 6 to 7 sets and pretty much fucking annihilate my calves. And my calves, same thing. They really don't ever get sore. And that was the only time my calves grew over an inch in the period of like a little over a month. And then it's a pain in the ass to keep up with that, right? So I stopped doing that. But outside of that time frame, my calves have never made as much progress, especially not in that time frame.
Yeah. So if you add that up, like you were training like 5 or 6 days a week, right?
Yeah, but I would come in on
35 to
just
40.
rest days just to do calves.
Okay. Yeah. So you're training calves 5 to 6 times a week, right?
Yep.
And you're training 7 sets each time. So you're training like 35 to 42, just way more than 20 sets. What are you thinking? Right.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
sometimes you got to do that. So what you would do with Fortitude training is you would just say, I'm going to stick with the tier structure. And the structure just gives you structure. So sometimes people want to go and it's like, oh, I'm not going to do that. That won't work with me. I'm like, hey, if you follow it just as it is, then you'll see, okay, this was too much. Like this muscle was always sore. This muscle never got sore. And then you can compare with all the thousands of people that are on my discussion board who've done Fortitude training. And you all did the same thing. You all like walked the same path. And they say, okay, I'm going to modify it. But you could just take that structure and just say, I'm going to train my weak muscle groups at volume tier 3 and everything else at volume tier 1. And maintaining is a breeze, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you just all you have to do is like look up and eventually you know what you're doing, right? After you've done that for a few weeks, you don't have to even look at the overview sheets anymore.
Yeah. So what do you attribute that to though? Like the fact that say, execution's on point, the person is executing the way they should be. They have a connection established, but for something like, the forearms or calves, why they're so stubborn and why somebody may need to just do that much and really just annihilate to see them grow.
So there's a dose response that's gonna vary, right? Yeah. Like the calves, for instance, like who the most, if you look at what calves do, and this is sort of a teleological explanation, but if you look at like some of the best sprinters in the world or some of the best sprinting or long distance running, like some of the best sprinters have itty bitty gastrocnemiae, like they're teensy because the muscle is biomechanically, the muscle is set up just to produce tension in the long spring of the Achilles tendon. So it's part of a biomechanical chain where the power during running or sprinting is really generated at the hip joint, it's translated through the knee and the ankle, and you just want to have an elastic spring, which is why you have this really long. If it really was a matter of having lots of muscle mass, that everyone had this giant calf, this just monster, your legs would probably have bigger calves than quads, right? Your thighs would be small, but no, you've got this translational momentum across those joints. And then you have a spring effect, a stretch shortening that happens. So the calf muscle is just biomechanically, it's there just to produce keep tension, so you can have some stretching in the Achilles tendon that just makes more sense energetically. So you've got dose response. For whatever reason, it just takes a lot more for you to grow. You're just not someone who naturally grows, let's say. And then there's also, and this is what I always wondered about, loading history is important too. So that means like, what is the load that the calf has been associated with, especially potentially during growth and development. So you take, there are epigenetic changes that can happen. So you take someone who grew up as an overweight child and then became obese and was obese. You see these obese people, especially if they diet down and they have these gigantic calves, right? And they weren't doing any calf training directly, except that they were walking around all the time with heavy loads on the calves. But it wasn't like, although it was certainly effortable, don't get me wrong, if you're walking around at 400 pounds, but it's not like they're doing like calf raises, to 0 reps in reserve, anything like that.
Yeah.
There was just loading there, and they're probably, It may have been part of what came along with the genetic programming that made them obese or tended to be obese. But I think there's also some loading history factors there where it was loaded. Because one of my examples for that is Scott McNally, who I do my podcast with. He does all the Think Big podcasts, and
Yeah.
his calves are world class. They're ridiculous. He doesn't ever have to train them. And
Mhm.
we figured this out a few years ago. And I'm like, dude, so you do walk? You probably, I've seen this before. How do you walk? You probably walk around on your tippy toes on the ball of your foot a lot, right? He's like, yeah, I kind of do. He used to run that way. When he'd run, he'd have no heel strike, which some people say is how you're supposed to run anyway. So his loading history since he was a kid was to run around and require like way more plantar flexion just during normal gait than your average person. And he sent me a video. This is a couple of years ago now. If we talked, he's like, yeah, you're right. I think that's what it is. And he put his camera on his phone on the ground and he filmed his feet while he was doing side laterals. And the entire time his heels aren't on the ground. He's balancing himself on his forefoot. It's like, well, there's no need for, like, people don't do that. He's just biomechanic, neurologically set up to be using his plantar flexors like all the time, and they're gigantic. So I think there's a connection there.
See, that's interesting because you see a lot of people say, I don't argue against this because I do, especially love loaded stretches for the calf. Say that the stretch part is the stretch, the bottom range of motion is the most important for the calf. In terms of hypertrophy. But then also, like you said, if you look at, especially like women who wear high heels all the time, you see that a lot too. Women have huge calves. Like, you can't deny that there's a lot of anecdotal evidence there. But for some reason, a lot of people, at this point, I've also seen people say, like, don't even train the top range of motion of a calf raise.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I really don't think we see all this biological individuality. We see people like from the Carriera study that I mentioned before, Carniera study. High reps work better for some people than low reps. You see this. You see Dorian Yates. I mean, Dorian was very meticulous about what made him grow the best. You've heard it in the interviews. Like, he was doing more, and he finally figured out less was better for him. I think in his case, if training like Ronnie Coleman would have been more optimal, he would have figured it out probably, but he didn't. So there's no obligation on the muscle to grow. We have some people who just don't grow in studies. There's some people who are just non-responders. So it's not like, and we try to compartmentalize. This has been one of the themes here. We try to say, no, this is the best strategy because we're all uniform, homogeneous Homo sapiens. This is what produces muscle growth. Training in the stretch position, blah, blah, blah. Well, you walk around in high heels all the time where you have to actively plantar flex and you're activating that muscle just to be able to stand and stabilize yourself. It's activation. It's in the shortened position, but it's still activation. And if you're someone, and some women don't get big calves that way. Someone you see,
Yeah.
you notice the women who have big calves, right? You see them. It's like, oh, and he's wearing heels. Okay, so
Yeah.
but that's not a random sampling per se. There are women who walk around in heels and don't have great calves. But I think there's probably something to that. I'm not Charlie throwing that out. But I mean, if you look at the animal research, and these aren't humans, but there's one study that I can talk about where you do a compensatory hypertrophy model, and you take the calf muscle, speaking calves, and you cut out the soleus, and you watch the other muscles of the calf grow, the plantaris and the gastroc in a rat, and they'll grow tremendously, and they're just walking around. So those muscles compensate by hypertrophy, right? But they're not doing any special stretching like that. It's a chronic overload, and they're not running them on a treadmill or training them. There are rodent weightlifting regimes that can be used where you put backpacks on rats and train them to walk up ladders. I had a regime that I borrowed from Wong and Booth from decades ago, where we would put a nerve cuff on the tibial nerve to create plantar flexion and have to anesthetize the rats, and we train their plantar flexors against like a little calf raise machine with electrical stimulation. But you get tremendous growth just by taking out one of the muscles, and the muscle just grows because it needs more. It's not resistance exercise. It's just that's a.
Well, how are
Go ahead.
What were you gonna say? You
No,
finish
that's
up.
another stimulus for muscle growth. The greatest muscle growth you see in the literature is with the stretch overload of the avian models, where they take quail and they hang a weight, and the quail's anterior isthmus dorsi grows. It's kind of like if you carried a huge dumbbell around, what would happen to your trap? You get a big trap. You probably would separate your shoulder half over time, but you see the most impressive muscle growth in any study I've ever seen was one that Jose Antonio did with this stretch overload and quail, and they used a progressive overload model. They stretched them for a couple days, took a day off. They did it over 28 days, and it was just massive growth. So HIT works, Mike Mentzer works for some people, and you can train with super high volume, and that works for people too.
Now, how do you have? I don't know what your calves look like off the top of my head. Would you say you have good calves?
Oh, I've torn them. They were okay. I've torn both of them. Yeah. Um,
Were they like weak points at any point in your career, or
they
did
were.
you
I
naturally
mean,
have good?
I've never had a particular strong point. My back was pretty good, I guess. I've torn pretty much everything has slowly torn. Been training for over 40 years, so things sort of the wear and tear comes to get you. But yeah, the right side, I think I felt like a small tear, like nothing like, oh shit, I tore my calf or tore my Achilles. Just felt a little pop in there. The left side once. There's still some medial gastroc remaining on the left side. The right one is totally rolled back. So they look
That's
like
crazy.
crap now. But that happens to lots of bodybuilders. It happens to, and their back, like Jay Cutler, someone you could see his back started doing that. My back has done that too. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so the constant wear
Well,
and tear takes its toll eventually.
I was just going to ask if there was anything that you did in your career where you were like, I really want to bring up my calves that you thought were the best. If you ever had that situation yourself.
Um, yeah, I wish they wouldn't have started degenerate because it happened like, God, it was maybe 12 or 15 years ago when I started going downhill. It was just a little bit. I did do DC training, which is the DC calf training is different from the rest of the regime. And you're basically doing about 15-second holds in the stretch position. Of course, he was way ahead of his time, right? So you're doing
Mm-hmm.
about 20. The way I would program people is they do a rep every 20 seconds. So you just get your watch, get your timer set up, and you push up, 5 seconds down, hold, wait till you hit 20 seconds. So you're holding for about 15 seconds, come up again. So you're doing like 3 reps every minute.
Mm-hmm.
Those actually did not work very well for me. I got really strong. I was doing like 3 minute. If you're doing 9 reps, that's taking 3 minutes, right? So I was doing
Yeah.
I was doing a 3.5, 4 minute set, and I was doing like leg press calf raises with 8, 9. I think I got up to maybe 10 plates on a side, and they're
Uh
brutally
huh.
painful, and I wasn't getting good growth out of them. So
No.
I did better with rest pause. I went back and did rest pause sets, but
For
for
calves.
calves, yeah, and those worked pretty well for me. But um, I tried everything. I pushed so hard that they started sort of tearing back. So I never got to really have a success story there,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
What what about forearms? Do you think there's any specific way that you advocate for growing those? I know a lot of guys
Yeah,
will say that you can't even grow your forearms. It's purely just genetics, which I don't. I mean, obviously you said some people just don't
you
grow,
can't. I think you
but I
can't.
think there definitely is a way to grow your forearms.
Um, I rarely do I see people stretching their forearms.
Yeah.
So like reverse wrist curls, I got good growth out of those. That seemed like it stayed, right? So I don't do them that often, but I got to where I could do like sets of 10 or 12 with a reverse wrist curl. So all the way down to the tips of my fingers, all the way up till I'm completely closed on the bar, and then flexing at the wrist. So finger and wrist flexion, just standing up with the barbell behind my back. I could do like
Mm-hmm.
185 for 12 reps. Um, it was funny
That's a lot.
because we would do those as part of DC training. I do that was training with Dave Henry, and our strength was pretty much the same. He was always stronger on chest stuff. Back stuff, I could maybe get him every once in a while, like on hinge type movements. Legs were pretty close, um, but he never would train his forearms. It never hardly ever trained his triceps. His triceps were just tremendous, just naturally, just huge. And he didn't like forearm training either because they just grew, right. For him,
Mm-hmm.
if he touches the weight, things grow pretty much more than most people. And I was like twice as strong as him on the forearms. His forearms look tremendously better than mine. but I was like twice as
Mhm.
strong as him on forearms. It's partly because I trained that way, and eventually they got to be okay. So, but stretching them, you can stretch your forearms. Um, so you do a curl, right? You do a curl and then you stretch this way. So you take your hand, put it. I can't really show
Yeah.
because I'm too close, but put your hand flat against the wall, right?
Yeah.
Afterwards, hold that stretch. You can do both in the same time. Hold it for 60, 90 seconds after you've just done, a high rep set, and it's brutal. Um,
Yeah.
I think the thing too that you see with people who have this is just an observation, but the people who have really good forms are people that don't always use straps all the time, or they do learn, they are picking up heavy ass weights even with straps. So if you're doing like, I don't know, 500, 600 pound rack deads, even with straps, your forearms get taxed. So they have to
Yeah.
get strong, right? But
Yeah.
if you're always finding like little isolation movements and you never do anything where your forearms are taxed, then they won't grow because there's a form function relationship. This is what I was talking about getting strong and the muscle will show. One thing you can
Yeah.
do that I've told people, and this would be kind of this isn't a formal part of fortitude training, what have you, is if you want to, like when you do your biceps training, whenever this would not adversely affect your back training, your biceps training, is after your set, assuming that you still have the strength to train your back, let's say if you start doing this, but after your back sets, go and just do a hang. So it's just finish your
Okay.
back set and then just hang as long until you just fall off. And you want to make it really,
Uh-huh.
or you can also do that after you've done forearm training. So let's say you've done a rest pause set for forearms, right? And then you hang on a bar until you fall, and then shake it off for a second, get back up there, try to hang for another 5 seconds, go to failure, right? Shake it off and do 2 or 3 of those, right?
That's brutal.
It's really brutal. And then do a stretch afterwards. So same kind of thing with calves. Like people I don't really see people like just going to town on training the forearm flexors.
No, I never see it either. I
Yeah.
never see really people, I see people try to do it for calves, not as much as they should. But forearms, everybody talks about you can't grow forearms, but I really never see anybody actually program and try to actually put the same effort that they would for another muscle group to grow as for forearms.
Yeah. It's in fortitude training. Forearms are in there. And you can
Oh,
do, if you want to
okay.
train the brachioradialis more so, or the wrist extensors, you can do that. You can put some brachialis, you can build brachialis movements into, of course, how you train biceps, but forearms are part of fortitude training. So you're doing forearm muscle rounds, and you can do forearms as part of your pump sets if you want as well. You can just throw that in there. But
And
yeah.
would you do that very frequently? You obviously frequency you would do that more frequently. Forearms aren't going to really tax you too much. At least I would
No,
just expect them not to.
I mean,
Yeah.
that would, like, let's say someone comes to me, they really want big forearms because they're in short sleeve shirts all the time and they want to have awesome forearms. I would say whenever they do pulling movements, do that at the end of their pulling movements, whatever they are, back movements, do that hang thing, right? And just hang there as long as you can. And then, if whenever they can, as long as they're, don't want to slide backwards on their back, but don't use straps. Don't
Mm-hmm.
use anything to aid in your grip. I mean, that will help for sure. And then train the bejesus out of them, but make sure that they're hit as often as you possibly can, because you're not. I mean, unless you like have to write, unless you're like a surgeon. Like, for instance, my dad was an eye doctor, and he used to really like to bowl. Wasn't a huge bowling, but he couldn't bowl, or he could bowl like once in a blue moon because he used to do surgery on Thursdays, and if he bowled like on a Monday, just a little bit of stress on his hands, he'd have shaky hands. So he's
Yeah.
doing eye surgery, so that's not good. So unless you like have to have like fine motor control over your hands, you could train the bejesus out of your forearms. You can hit them. You could hit
Yeah.
them just like you did with calves and do that. But that hanging
Yeah.
thing just adds in like it's almost nothing, you know. And
Uh-huh.
stop using
Yeah.
straps. Stop assisting. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of
Yeah.
people really would go against the whole strap thing because then they'll say, I'm trying to train back for back, not for forearms. But if you're somebody who wants to train forearms, you kind of got to give and take, right? You
Yeah.
want bigger forearms. Like, what's really the priority? Getting the most out of the back or having a little bit of forearms in there too? If that's really your priority, right? You
Yeah.
got to pick and choose.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, you could use straps on your sets when you absolutely need them, right?
Yeah, of
And
course.
then afterwards, hit the forearms with the hang thing, or just do a set of reverse wrist curls like right afterwards. So you've
Yeah.
done your back training, got that taken care of. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I won't ever use straps unless I pretty much need to on a working set. Like everything up
yeah,
to that will be just freehand, or even if the like, because some machines are just way easier to hold than others. Like
mm-hmm.
that at that point, I just don't even bother using them. If it's something that's obviously the grip is affecting me, then at that point I'll implement them. But
Yeah,
I don't really have an issue with that. If that was really like a major issue and I couldn't hold
yeah.
225 in a bar, I'd probably be a little bit concerned about that.
I mean, another option too. This wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't like say no. You're not doing fortitude training if you do this. But another thing you can do too is if you do notice the grip, you can get like Versa grips. There's another style. What's the name of it? They're leather. I used to go through Versa grips every 6 months, and they would just break down and start to stink. They never worked for me.
I've had like 5 pairs stolen.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. I never had that. No
Yeah.
one would steal mine because they smelled awful. So maybe that's the clue.
Yeah.
You need to like put them in a Ziploc baggie and let them fester between your workouts. But
Maybe.
whatever the other form is that I have, I probably should look it up so I can remember to tell people. But I've had that one for like 5 or 6 years now. Works great. But what you could do is during your sets, depends on the exercise. It's not always going to work. But start your set with no grip assistance, and then real quick, just flip those on for the rest of your set, and then go to failure. So you do your first 8 reps, whatever. You're like, okay, I'm starting to feel like I'm starting to lose my grip. Add the grip assistance. So now you've trained your grip literally to failure each of those sets, and now you get to train your back to failure. And you don't, and hopefully then you with the grip assistance, you've got enough assistance that you can actually effectively hit your back without losing your grip. So, and
Mm-hmm.
that can be done every set almost on most things. If you're doing deadlifts or whatever, you just strap up with the Versa grip style grips. It takes like 2 seconds, and that's no big deal. And
Yeah.
if you're willing,
Yeah.
if that's what you want, if you really want the grip, if you really want the forearms, then that's a small price to pay. It's not going to affect you in
Yeah.
the long run. It's like, oh my God, my back didn't grow because I had 2 seconds rest in the middle of my sets. No, it's not going to matter.
Yeah.
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 Just make note of it in
No.
your logbook if you need to.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting approach. But
Yeah.
before we hop off here, last thing I want to ask you is, in your opinion, what do you think are like 3 to 5 of the most overlooked aspects of bodybuilding that you think really are important and really do make a difference?
Since we talked about a lot, progressive overload. People just don't want to load their logbooks. There's different roads to China. If you, like I said, if you just take someone who's training, they're eating enough, which is the other thing I was going to say. They're doing all the things bodybuilding, and they just get themselves strong as hell. They're not gonna like Phil Heath, but they're gonna be a bigger muscular version of themselves. And you
Mm-hmm.
almost can't go wrong as long as you're just not over like being a butthead and overtraining, what have you. Like if you just get stronger in those rep ranges, it's going to manifest in some way. If you just did powerlifting, you may not be the most muscular version you possibly could if that's all you did, like we talked about before. But just not log booking stuff, or at least the alternative to log booking that I suggest sometimes for people is take your basic exercises, your favorites that you like to do, that you do regularly, and give yourself a test rep maximum set like once a month on those. So it's your day you're training legs and you come around to whatever squat variation you do that you like. Okay, I'm going to load it up to X number of plates and get as many reps as I can. Okay, I got two more reps, and I'll come back and I'll do that a month or two later. And just within your workouts, as part of your workout, give yourself a test to see if you're going the right direction. And what that
Yeah.
does, even that small, it's like, okay, I'm actually stronger than I thought I was. I should be using more weight because I just beat the shit out of that. That it will be enough motivation for some people to adjust their training and realize, okay, I need to keep pushing this because they know it's coming then. Like, okay, I
Yeah.
know I got this last time. I'm not like, writing everything down and lying awake at night thinking, oh shit, I got the logbook I got to beat tomorrow. It's like, no, but it does help. The other thing is recognize, I think that you're going to be able to get newbie type gains, like you can drop fat and gain muscle at the same time. That's just wonderful. There's so much emphasis on PEDs, which allow you to do stuff like that. Creates it's a whole other world when you start training assisted. But at some point in time, once you get to whatever your PED use and or your genetic limit allows, just with some basic modicum of balanced, reasonable training, eventually you're going to have to put on some body fat potentially to gain more muscle mass. And I've got that in my Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach book. Doesn't mean you need to turn into a blob. You can use a DEXA scan to kind of monitor yourself, but you may have to get bigger and feel uncomfortable in your own skin to some degree.
Yes.
And to whatever degree you do that, like everyone's got their governors. People, once they get to where I'm as fat as I'm going to let myself be, they just got to turn back. Some people just won't go past that. They'll think, oh, I got to do this, that, and the other, and maybe they'll just try to take more gear, whatever. But just knowing that that's the case. And then I think the other thing is auto regulation. Is like I get all these questions like how many sets. There's not picking on you. That was a good question, but like if I do a rest pause set, is that 2 sets or 3 sets? It's like just none of those questions. Like I have one guy who comes back to me like every 6 months and he asks me is it better to do like 2 sets of 5 to 8 or with 0 reps in reserve or 3 sets of 10 with 2 reps in reserve? And I'm like, dude, try it out. Just go. Jordan Peters is great. People will ask about this, that, and the other. And he's like, it's like, why are you asking me? He's pretty nice about it. Sometimes he's really kind of short with people appropriately, I think. It's like, just go give it a go. Just go try it out.
Yeah.
Like people are looking online for answers to stuff when they could just like go figure it out themselves. Is like, what's the best way to clean my gutters? I notice my gutters are full of junk. It's like, do I'm going to go on Google or YouTube and try to figure out? I'm like, no, I'm just going to get up there and say, okay, what's it look like? Right? Is it like totally cocked over where I can't get it out with my hand? I need to bring a professional in. Just do it yourself. At least give it a go. And people don't recognize how much they can actually just figure it on their own because they're surrounded by all this information. And sometimes it's like saying, I guess sometimes people ask me questions and it's like, you're asking me like what your favorite flavor of ice cream should be. I don't know. It's whatever you want to do, man. Like I can't tell. I can't see the future. Just give it a try. And then you'll know if you like training with higher volume or not. I can't tell you. So I think that's a missing thing that people miss out on because of the way information is so excessive these days.
It's very hard to convey that to people. And the reason why I'm asking these questions is I ask all these people this stuff is because I know what the listeners are asking. Like I know this stuff doesn't really matter. And like you said, what we said before, in a lot of cases, the answer is it depends. And people don't like that answer because it's not something black and white. And that's hard to sell. And people are used to getting thrown this information at them where this is the best way, you should do this. And when you can't really give somebody that answer because you just knowing that that's not really the truth and it does depend and there's so much other context needed and what this individual preference whatever goes into it, there's always going to be so many variables. It's the person doesn't like to hear that, right? So they're just always looking for this is the answer, what should I do this with this reps in reserve or that? And that's really like the point of this podcast is to dive in the conversations and help people understand like why there's so much nuance and why you can't really give a direct answer. Just try things out, do the research, listen to this guy, listen to that guy, take everything with a grain of salt, be a sponge, soak everything up, and be able to form your own conclusions through practical application over time.
Yeah, I've got a whole chapter in my book on that. I'm based on knowing who to trust, trying to figure out like what information makes sense to you. There's I think the title of the article on Elite FTS is knowing who to trust, right? Yeah. How do we obtain knowledge? How do we figure out like what makes sense, what doesn't make sense? This could have been like that guy in the gym. Look, those guys who beat you to a pulp, when you first started training, who just trained you into the hole, right? They formed you to a certain degree. And the things that they say with good reason, I think, are going to weigh heavier than some influencer who just popped up on your feed who says something that's opposite. You're like, I trust these guys. I saw them do it. I lived it. I experienced it. Something I say because of our conversation might weigh heavier than some other person who just pops in because we had a talk and hopefully some of the things I said made sense to you. But just being aware of why it is that you trust the different bits and pieces of information. The science is there. It's got its limitations, its delimitation, all that kind of stuff. The bro science is there. The thing that's one of the most difficult things in the bodybuilding world is if you look at someone's physique, that is indicative of their knowledge level, but genetics rule the roost. And there are many people who have the best physiques in the world, and very few of them go without coaches because they're not. There's various reasons for that, but a lot of them are not amongst the upper echelons in terms of bodybuilding knowledge. Actually, it can be the opposite. I think I've heard Phil talk about this too, because I've been harping on this for years. Is if you're looking for someone who's going to help you find your path to whatever muscle growth that you need, look for someone who's traveled a similar path. So, not picking on Phil Heath, but he's a great example. They call him a gift for a reason. It's like, if I have the best bodybuilding genetics in the world, I might go talk to Phil Heath because I'm going to go and win my place first in my first show, win the overall in the next show I do, win the junior nationals, win the USAs, and win my first two pro shows, like Phil did, right? And then win the Olympia like 3 years later. Like, did he have to like buckle down and listen to 15 podcasts about how to train calves to figure out how to make them to grow? It's like, no. He probably just like, whatever. He just went in. They probably would have grown almost as 90% just from training legs, right? Yeah. So that person's path, not to pick on, but that person's path is different than yours. You need to find someone who's traveling the same kind of road you've had to travel. And then okay, this guy's driving a Pinto. This guy drove a Pinto and he managed to get to the North Pole. I'm driving a Pinto. I want to get to the North Pole. I'm not going to talk to the guy who's got the $200,000 off-road rig, right? That has got, 90-gallon gas tank. Doesn't apply to me. That's not those aren't the challenges I'm going to have. I need to find someone who's had similar challenges. His information is more relevant to mine. To me, it's as simple as that, I think.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Or if the person has shown to be able to provide results and consistent proof for people in similar positions as you, because like you look like Hani, right? I see all the people Hani's coach, right? It's like Hani was never in that position, right? But I don't even want to say whether or not Hani is obviously, like, Hani's proven himself in many aspects, but just because a coach hasn't been obese before doesn't mean that they can't get an obese person in shape, right?
Right. And looking at Hani, like Hani, he has tremendous success with phenomenal competitors. And there's something to say. You're working with, like, if you have a Ferrari, you would take yourself to the Ferrari mechanic, right? But you probably wouldn't take your Pinto in. It's like, what are you bringing this in here for anyway? I don't even deal with that. I don't know what this is. I don't use this. I don't know how to find spare parts for a Pinto. I never do it. So if you're, let's say you're a millionaire but you're a 350-pound obese person, you say, Hani Rambod, I want you to train me because you're the best bodybuilding trainer in the world. He probably is not the best bodybuilding trainer in the world for that person, because that person isn't the type of clientele he has his experience with. And that's nothing against Hani. Exactly. You'd have to find someone who has done that before, who knows, who articulates, for instance, with physicians who are going to give them a GLP-1 agonist, let's say, right? Who knows that the person, what it's like after bariatric surgery, and has worked with lifestyle clients who have disordered eating and a distorted body image. And it's a whole other ball game, right? So, So pick pick someone who matches who you are as far as a coach or whoever you listen to.
Yeah, I was just going to touch on that because you do see a lot of these like lifestyle guys go to these elite bodybuilding coaches and they can't handle the client because the client doesn't operate the same way that a serious competitive bodybuilder is. Like, they need all these modifications. They want to do this way. They have these jobs. And from the guy who's only worked with, the top elite genetics, it's like, okay, well, if you can't eat 6 meals every 2 hours on the dot, it's like you just aren't willing to do the work. It's just not a compatible relationship in a lot of scenarios.
Right. Yeah. I like the mechanic analogy. Like, I was in Tampa. I had a guy named Mike, Mike's Garage on Bush Boulevard, or just off Bush. Guy's awesome. He loved tackling all sorts of new stuff, but every once in a while there was something like, I don't know about that. And there was a guy who was like an F350 expert. He was an expert on 1-tons. And I talked to him about some of the stuff I do with my truck. So depending on what vehicle you have, you got to go to the right mechanic. You don't go to like a guy who's only done cars to have your motorcycle worked on, if you got a high-end motorcycle. So it's really as simple as that. But we don't, because our body is involved, it's not our car. We can see it as an objective thing. It's our body. And we see this as who we are. And our egos are wrapped up in all of this. And it makes it very hard to make those sort of what seem like, the way we're talking about it now, very easy objective decisions. It's very hard to separate who we feel like we are. And people feel like, gosh, if I can't do what so-and-so can do bodybuilding wise, that means I'm somehow lesser than them. because bodybuilding is so important for me, right? And even if it's conscious or unconscious, that's a hard thing to swallow, just to say, shit, this is my passion and I got shit genetics for it. This sucks. So
Yeah.
people then will go and try to do things that bang the head against the wall and use lots of gear, risk their health, et cetera, pay coaches who take advantage of them, blah, blah, blah. And if it were the car, they would just say like, gosh, I'm not going to try to enter into the, Formula One race with my Pinto, because I just don't have the right materials here. I don't have a
Yeah.
$400,000 Formula One vehicle. I just can't afford that. My genetic cards weren't played in that way, but it's difficult to do that. So you lose your objectivity, and it's a tough thing for someone who really has a lot involved with it.
Yeah, that is another good point. There's a lot of delusion in bodybuilding, more so than you see with really any other sports. Like you said, if you had a Pinto, you wouldn't go try to race it. If you had, if you were 5'4", you probably know like you're not going to go to the NBA. It's not going to be big. But a lot of people, for whatever reason, like no matter what they look like, it's like you could be Mr. Olympia, you could outwork your genetics, and it's just it seems like a much harder pill to swallow than it is for really any other competitive sport.
The thing, people like, there's this notion, that this question, like, what do the pros take, right?
Not a lot. Most of them, as far as I know.
Yeah, and a lot of some of them take a lot, but
some do.
Yeah, but the very nature of the question is kind of bizarre one to me, because like we got the Olympics going on now, right? And let's say like, what is Noah Lyles? What are his supplements, right? Or how does he eat? I want to be fast like Noah Lyles. I'll just eat his diet, right? It's like, no matter what you do, the average person, you're not getting below probably 12 seconds for a 100-meter dash. He's going to be having his lunch, and you're still struggling to get across the finish line. It doesn't matter any of those things. So the genetic role, the NBA is a great example, Usain Bolt, whatever, all the other best athletes in the world, there's a huge genetic component, obviously tons of work to go into maximizing what those genetics would allow. But when we ask questions about what the pros do and how they train, those aren't necessarily the relevant questions, because I think one of the things, back to bodybuilding, and we're making this a little longer here with this last closing segment, but one of the things that I've sort of noticed, it seems like, and we had Brandon Curry on my podcast a few years back now, and he's talking about what happens there in the Middle East when people come in, is that a lot of the best bodybuilders in the world can train harder and longer. Ronnie's a great example, and still recover from it. So having that recovery aspect is the other side of the coin of being able to train harder and longer and create a greater stimulus. It's only a better stimulus if you can recover from it. So the recovery resources are what's needed on the other side after you've created a massive stimulus, massive inroads or whatever. So those two things go side by side. So you take your average person, back to what we said before, you try to train like Ronnie, you're not going to look like Ronnie. You'll go backwards. Most people, if they tried to do Ronnie's program and train as hard as him, regardless of what stuff they were on, they probably would just get smaller. Just wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
It wouldn't get better, regardless of how much Masterpiece barbecue sauce you put on your French fries. It's still not going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the thing, that it's just, there's a logical error that's being made, I think, in many people's minds. So that's like, to get back to your question, like this, recognizing that, find the person who's on your path, avoid making that logical error, as long as difficult as it is, because it's a human thing to do. Look for I'll say it this way. This is my last comment on this. It's a totally normal thing when I think about this. This is my armchair evolutionary biologist perspective or psychologist perspective. In a small group, a small tribe of individuals where we do have genetic homogeneity, right? So everyone is pretty much somewhat closer to being genetically equal, you would expect. There's obviously some variability. That's a natural part of nature as well. So there's some advantages so that some would survive and others wouldn't, in case of some sort of tragedy or disaster. But if you look at someone in your tribe, and let's say, whatever, all of a sudden one guy is like, he's bringing back twice. They go out to collect firewood and he's bringing back twice as much as everyone else. You think, well, he's not twice as big as everyone else, like, because everyone's the same size. He's doing something different. What's the secret? Yeah. Right? That makes sense. So you learn from that person. You ask them, figure out how they're doing it. So then when we go and we go into the modern day world where we've got just genetic variability out the yin yang. You don't have that homogeneity that you had in your small tribe where everyone is basically equipped with the same genetic tools. And you've got people who are just genetically elite in the bodybuilding context. And they're genetically, the natural inclination in our minds is to think, oh, what's this guy doing different? What's he doing? And that's just something I think I suspect there's an evolutionary derived tendency to think in that manner because it made sense in our evolutionary past that the person who's doing better things, it's not because he has some genetic advantage, because he likely doesn't. He's just got a better strategy. So you want to figure what that is. But in bodybuilding, it's not also it can be, but it's a lot of times not a better strategy. It's better genetics. So being aware that our brains are maybe evil. This is again, I'm not an evolutionary biologist or what have you, not a psychologist, but it's my guess, at least it's a functional paradigm to think that our brains have evolved to make us look at people who do things better than us as if they're doing something that we could also be doing. What it may just be that they're smarter, they're taller, they're naturally faster, or they just naturally put on more muscle mass than we do. Yeah. And just be aware of that. Like that's a logical fallacy that's built into our brains that if you can avoid, I think it's to your advantage.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely agree with that. So before we wrap up here, you got anything you got going on? Anything you want to plug?
No. I mean, it may be a while, but I may be back on the road doing some seminars. So if anyone listens to this by chance, they want to have me at their gym or whatever, it would have to depend on where I'm driving because I'll have my dogs in tote. But I think I'm going to be doing seminars again, like live seminars. And I got a bunch of topics. So cool. Yeah, anyone who hears this and wants me to do one, let me know, and at least I can jot it down as a potential seminar in the future.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. I'd like to go to something like that. But all right, man. If any of you aren't following Scott, make sure you check him out. I'll put his @ down below. Yeah, thanks for coming on, man. Thanks for coming on 2 days in a row.
Yeah,
it was an honor.
Yeah, we got some content. I think we got like 3 hours of stuff, so we're good. This would keep people happy for a while. This was fun.
Yeah, so if you guys like this episode, make sure you like it. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you on the next episode of Brass Tack Bodybuilding. Peace out.
Adios.